Volume 1 Chapter 0. Kalak rounded a rocky ridge and almost tripped over a dying thunderbreaker. The huge stone beast lay on its side, the rib-like appendages protruding from its chest were broken and crumbled. The monster looked like a skeleton with unnaturally long arms growing straight from its granite shoulders. On the triangular face, small red eyes sat deeply, as if created by a fire blazing in the depths of the stone. They have already gone out. Even after all these centuries, Kalak shuddered when he saw the thunderbreaker so close. The monster's palm was no smaller than an adult's. He himself was killed by the same hands. Not a very pleasant memory. Few people enjoy remembering their own death. He circled the beast, trying to choose his path across the battlefield more carefully. There was almost nothing on the plain except ugly boulders surrounded by stone columns and a few plants. And the bodies littering the ground. Numerous scars remained on the stone ridges and mounds. Some of the rocks near which the warriors fought were shattered. Less common were strange depressions in the stone. Thunderbreakers burst out of them and entered into battle. Many of the bodies scattered about were human, many were not. The blood is mixed. Red, orange, purple. Although not a single body moved, a mist of sound hung in the air, groans of pain and wails of sorrow. It doesn't sound like screams of victory. Streams of smoke curled over the occasional surviving plants and heaps of burning corpses. Even the stones were burning. The dust bringers worked conscientiously. But I survived, Kalak thought, putting his hand to his chest and hurrying to the meeting place. This time I actually survived. It was very dangerous. When he died, there was nothing else to do but send him back. And when he experienced the devastation, he still had to return. Back to the very place he feared. A place of fire and pain. What if he decided not to go? Dangerous thoughts, even treacherous ones. He quickened his pace. The meeting place was in the shadow of a large stone column that rose high into the sky. As usual, all 10 chose him before the battle. The survivors must gather here. Strange, but only one was waiting for him. Jizrian. Are the other 8 really dead? Maybe. This time the battle was fierce, one of the bloodiest. Each time the enemy remained more and more steadfast. But no. Kalak, frowning, approached the base of the column. 7 wonderful blades stood proudly there, stuck into the rocky ground. Each one was a work of art, gracefully shaped, with glyphs and patterns carved into the blade. He recognized them all. If their owners died, the swords would disappear. The blades were terrible weapons, even more powerful than the shard blades. They were unique, priceless. Jizrian stood outside the circle of swords, looking east. Jizrian? The figure in white and blue looked at him. Even after centuries, Jizrian looked like a young man, no more than 30. His short black beard remained clean and neat, in contrast to his once elegant, but now burnt and blood-stained clothes. He turned to Kalak, clasping his hands behind his back. What happened, Jizrian? Asked Kalak. Where are the others? They left. Jizrian's voice was calm, deep and majestic. He retained his royal manners, although he had not worn the crown for a long time. He always knew what to do. Or so it seemed. You can call it a miracle. This time only one of us died. Dalinar said Kalak. It was his blade that he was missing. Yes. He fell defending the passage to the northern channel. Kalak nodded. Dalinar managed to get involved in hopeless battles and win them. In addition, he had a bad habit of dying during the battle. Now he returned again to where they all were between the desolations. A place of nightmares. Kalak found himself trembling. When did he become a weakling? Jizrian, I won't come back this time. Whispering terrible words, Kalak approached the second man and grabbed his hand. I can't. Kalak felt something break in him after his confession. How long will this last? Centuries of torture, perhaps millennia. It's hard to keep track of time. Every day lights and hooks bite into your flesh. They burn the skin on the arm, then the fat, then the bones. He could smell burning meat. Oh Almighty, he could feel it. Leave the swords, said Jizrian. What? Jizrian nodded towards the ring of swords. I decided to wait for you. We weren't sure you survived. But we made a decision. The time has come to break the oath treaty. Kalak felt a sharp pang of fear. What will happen now? Isha believes that as long as at least one of us is bound by the oath treaty, that's enough. Perhaps we can end the cycle of devastation. Kalak looked into the eyes of the immortal king. To the left, a black column of smoke rose into the sky. The groans of the dying were heard behind them. Kalak saw suffering and sadness in Jizrian's eyes. Perhaps cowardice. This man was hanging by a thread over the abyss. The Almighty is above, thought Kalak. Are you really broken too? As everybody. Kalak turned away, walked to the edge of the low ridge, and looked around part of the battlefield. There were many corpses, but there were survivors walking among them. Men wrapped in skins held spears with bronze tips. Next to them are others, in shining armor. One such group passed by, 4 men in tattered tanned hides and primitive leather armor, along with a mighty warrior in shining silver armor of magnificent workmanship. What a contrast! Jezrien walked up to him. They look at us like gods, Kalak whispered. They rely on us, Jezrien. We're all they have. They have the shining ones. This should be enough. Kalak shook his head. They won't tie him up for long. The enemy. He will be able to get around them. You know. Maybe. The King of Heralds did not go into explanations. And town. Asked Kalak. Burning flesh. Lights. Pain, again and again. It's better to let one suffer than 10, Jezrien whispered. He seemed so cold. It was as if someone, honest and truthful, standing in the rays of hot bright light, threw away a black icy likeness. Jezrien walked up to the ring of swords. In the hands of the former king his own sword, still wet from the fog, condensed. Everything has already been decided, Kalak. We will go our own way and will not look for each other. Our blades will remain here. Today the oath treaty ended. He picked up the sword and stuck it into the stone next to the 7 others. Suddenly Jezrien hesitated, looked at the sword, bowed his head and turned away, as if he felt ashamed. We voluntarily took on this burden. We can reset it if we want. What do we tell people, Jezrien? Asked Kalak. And what will they say about today? Very simple, Jezrien said as he walked. We will say that they won. Finally. It's easy to lie now. And who knows, maybe it will become true. Kalak watched Jezrien walk across the burned ground. He finally summoned his own sword and stuck it into the stone next to the other 8. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction from Jezrien. Still, he couldn't help but look back at the only empty spot in the ring of swords. The place where the 10th sword should have been. The sword of the one who died. Who did they betray? Volume 1 Chapter 0.1. 4,500 years later. The love of men is cold, like a mountain stream 3 steps from the ice. We belong to him. O Father of storms, we belong to him. Just 1,000 days and the eternal storm will come. Received on the first day of the week of Pala in the month of Shash, 1171, 31 seconds before death. The subject is a dark-eyed, middle-aged, pregnant woman. The child did not survive. On the day when he was to kill the king, Seth's son Villano, the no truth of Sinova, put on white clothes, traditional to the Parshendi and alien to him. But he always did as his masters demanded and did not ask for explanations. He sat in a large stone hall, huge, brightly burning fireplaces illuminated the sweating revelers as they danced, drank, shouted, sang and clapped. Some, unable to drink any more, fell to the ground with reddened faces, their bellies proving to be worthless wineskins. And they lay as if dead until their friends carried them from the banqueting hall to the beds prepared in advance. Seth didn't bang drums, drink sapphire wine, or dance. He sat on the far bench, a modest servant in white. At the celebration of the signing of the agreement, few noticed him. An ordinary servant, and usually no one looked twice at the sun. Here in the East, people considered the people of Set to be obedient and harmless. By and large they were right. The drummers began a new tune. The blows shook Seth, as if 4 beating hearts sent waves of invisible blood through the hall. The hosts of Set in more civilized kingdoms they were contemptuously called savages sat at separate tables. These were people with marbled, black and red skin. They were called Parshendi, cousins of a people of obedient servants known in most countries as Parshmen. Strange. They themselves did not call themselves Parshendi, this name was given to them by the Alethi. It meant something like a Parshman who can think. For some reason, no one considered this an insult. The Parshendi brawled the musicians. At first the light-eyed Alethi were hesitant. For them, drums were the instruments of the dark-eyed simple people. However, wine is the great killer of tradition and decency, and now the Alethi nobles danced, forgetting about everything. Seth stood up and walked across the room. The feast lasted a long time, and the king went home several hours ago. But many were still celebrating. On the way, Seth had to pass the king's brother, Dalinar Colin, who was sitting at a small table. An elderly but strongly built man had drunk a fair amount, but waved away those who tried to take him to bed. Where is Jasna, the king's daughter? Ilhoka, the king's son and heir, sat at the central table, leading the feast in his father's absence. He was talking to 2 people. A dark-skinned Asian man with a strange patch of pale skin on his cheek, and a second, thinner Alethi-like man who was constantly looking over his shoulder. The prince's feasting interlocutors were of no interest. The Set walked far from Ilhoka, along the edge of the hall, not far from the drummers. Music spren floated through the air. The little spirits took the form of spinning transparent ribbons. They noticed him as Seth walked past the drummers. They will soon leave along with all the Parshendi. They didn't seem offended. They didn't seem angry. And yet they were going to break the agreement in a few hours. It was pointless. But Seth didn't ask questions. He walked past rows of lamps emitting an even azure light. They were located in those places where the walls connected to the floor. Each one contained a sapphire infused with stormlight. Blasphemers! Is it permissible to use this sacred stone for ordinary lighting? And to make matters worse, Alethi scientists claimed to be close to creating new shard blades. Seth hoped they were just showing off. Otherwise, the world will change to such an extent that in all countries from distant Talon to the highland Jarkived, there will only be people left who speak the Alethi language with their children. Yes, these Alethi are a great people. Even drunk, they radiated natural nobility. Tall, well-built men, dressed in dark silk uniforms, elaborately embroidered in silver or gold, with fastenings at the sides. Each of them seemed like a general on the battlefield. The women looked even more gorgeous. They wore beautiful silk dresses that flattered their figures. Their bright colors accentuated the dark clothing of the men. The left sleeve of the dress was longer than the right and covered the entire arm. A very strange idea of decency. Women wore their absolutely black hair beautifully in the form of intricately intertwined braids, or let it fall in loose strands. They were often woven with golden ribbons, jewelry, and gemstones that glowed with stormlight. Wonderful. Blasphemous, but wonderful. Seth left the feast hall through the back door and passed the door leading to the beggar's feast. According to Alethi traditions, the poorest men and women of the city were to feast with the king and his guests. A man with a long graying beard stood leaning against the door and smiled stupidly, whether from wine or dementia, Seth could not say for sure. Can you see me? He asked vaguely, then laughed, uttered some nonsense and reached for the wineskin. They always end up drunk. Seth brushed past, moving along the statues of the 10 heralds from the ancient Vorin religion. Jesir, Ishi, Kelek, Telenelet. He counted them only 9. One thing is clearly missing. Why was the Shalash statue removed? It was said that King Gavilar was a very devout follower of the Vorin religion, even too devout by some people's standards. The corridor here turned to the right, going around the perimeter of the domed palace. The set was on the 2nd royal floor. Stone walls, stone ceiling. He walked along the stone floor. Another blasphemy. You can't step on stone. But what could he do? He is not knowing the truth and must do what his masters demand. Today they made him wear white. Loose white pants tied at the waist with a rope, a thin shirt with long sleeves and a slit on the chest. Parshendi tradition is that the killer must be dressed in white. Although Seth didn't ask, the owners explained why. White means courage. White doesn't mix with the night. White is a warning. If you are going to kill a person, the victim has the right to look you in the eyes. Seth turned right and walked down the corridor leading to the royal chambers. There were torches burning on the walls, but their light was too little, like liquid broth after a long fast. Tiny flamespan danced around the torches, like insects made of frozen light. Yes, torches wouldn't help him. He reached for his bag of orbs, but hesitated when he saw several blue lights ahead. 2 stormlight lamps hung on the wall, bright sapphires glowing at their cores. Seth walked up to one of them and took hold of the glass covering the gem. Hey, you! Someone shouted in Alethi. At the intersection of the corridors there were 2 guards. Double guard, because there are savages in Kalina this night. True, it was assumed that these savages would now be allies. But alliances can be very short-lived. This one won't last more than an hour. Seth watched the guards approach him. In the hands of a spear, they are not light-eyed and therefore do not have the right to carry swords. However, the breastplates are red, like the helmets, and richly decorated. Although they are dark-eyed, they are still high-ranking citizens in honorable service in the royal guard. Stopping a few feet from Seth, the guard closest to him swung his spear. Leave immediately. You don't belong here. He had dark Alethi skin and a thin moustache that ran down the sides of his mouth and into a beard. Seth didn't move. Well. Said the guard. What are you waiting for? Seth took a deep breath, drawing stormlight from the 2 sapphire lamps on the wall. Stormlight poured into him, began to rage inside him, and the corridor suddenly darkened, the way Hilltop goes into shadow when passing clouds block out the sun. Seth felt the warmth of the light, its fury, as if a storm had been injected into his veins. Its power was invigorating, but dangerous. She pushed for action, towards movement, to the blow. Seth held his breath, thereby preventing the release of stormlight, and, as always, he felt it flow out. Stormlight could only be held for a short time, a few minutes at most. It leaked out. There are too many pores in the human body. Seth had heard that the void bridges could pacify him endlessly. But did they really exist? His punishment meant no. Honor said yes. Fueled by the fire of sacred energy, Seth turned to the guards. They could see stormlight flowing from it, clouds of which swirled against Seth's skin like glowing smoke. The head guard narrowed his eyes, thinking. The man had never seen anything like this before. Seth was sure of this, since he personally killed every stonewalker who happened to observe the killer in action. Who are you? Dash the guard's voice lost confidence. Dash spirit or man. Dash who am I? Dash Seth whispered, and a piece of light escaped his lips. He looked through the man down the long corridor. Dash I'm really sorry. Seth blinked, entwining himself with a distant point in the depths of the corridor. Stormlight burst out of him, cooling his skin, and at the same moment the earth stopped pulling him down. Instead, he felt drawn to that distant point for him, that was the bottom. Basic plexus, the first of 3 types of plexus. It gave him the ability to control the force that keeps people on Earth. Some called it a spren or even a god. Using the weave, he could pull people or objects to different surfaces and in different directions. From Seth's point of view, the corridor turned into a deep shaft into which he was falling, and the guards stood on one of its walls. With the full weight of his body, Seth hit them in the face and knocked them down. He shifted his gaze and entwined himself with the floor. Light streamed from him. The floor of the corridor went down again, and he landed between 2 guards. Seth's clothes were covered with flakes of frost and crackled. He stood up, beginning to summon the Blade of Shards. Volume 1 Chapter. One of the guards grabbed a spear. Seth leaned over him, touched the soldier's shoulder, looked up and concentrated on a point above him. The light obediently flowed out of Seth and entered the body of the guard, entwining the poor fellow with the ceiling. The guard screamed in horror. For him, up became down. Light sprayed from his body, he hit the ceiling and dropped his spear. It was not woven and fell to the floor next to Seth. Kill. The greatest sin. And yet Seth, not knowing the truth, came here precisely for this purpose, desecrating the stones used for the building with his tread. And that is not all. As the one who doesn't know the truth, he was allowed to take any life. Except one. Your own. At the 10th heartbeat, the Blade of Shards materialized in the extended hand. It formed as if condensed from mist, with droplets of moisture all over the blade. His shard blade was thin, double-edged, quite long, but shorter than other blades. Seth swung it, carving a line into the stone floor, and passing it through the second guard's neck. As always, the Blade of Shards killed in a strange way. Easily cutting through stone, steel or anything inanimate, the metal hissed when it touched a living creature. The blade passed through the guard's neck, leaving no trace, but the man's eyes began to smoke and flash. Then they turned black, shriveled, and the guard fell sharply forward, dead. The Blade of Shards did not cut living flesh, it tore apart the soul itself. The first guard spoke from above. He managed to get to his feet, although they were glued to the ceiling of the corridor. Dash Bearer of Shards. He yelled. Dash the Bearer of the Shards is attacking the palace. 2 arms. Finally, Seth thought. He used Stormlight to weave, something the guards had never seen before, but they recognized the Blade of Shards as soon as they saw it. Seth bent down and picked up the spear that had fallen from above. At the same time, he exhaled the air that he had been holding in his lungs. Since the moment he drew Stormlight into himself, it fueled Seth while it remained inside him. But there was very little light in those lanterns, so Seth would soon need to replenish his strength again, because when he breathed deeply, the light flowed out faster. Seth rested the blunt end of his spear on the stone floor, then looked up. The guard above him stopped shouting, and the tails of his shirt began to slide down as the ground gradually took over. The light flowing from his body was becoming depleted. The guard looked down at Seth, eyes wide with horror, and at the tip of the spear, aimed straight at his heart. A purple fistprint crawled out of the stone ceiling above him. The light has dried up. The guard fell down. And he screamed, running into a spear that pierced his chest. Seth released the shaft, and the spear with the body twitching at the end, fell to the ground with a dull sound. With the Blade of Shards in his hand, he turned into a side corridor, following the memorized map. Diving around the corner, he pressed himself against the wall just as a squad of guards reached the dead. The arrivals screamed, raising the alarm. He was given clear instructions. Kill the king, but without being noticed. Let the Alethi know who the killer is and who sent him. Why did the Parshendi sign the treaty? Just to send a killer on the night of his imprisonment. More gems shone on the walls of the corridor. King Gavilar loved luxurious decoration, but he could not know that he was leaving a source of power for Seth. What Seth did was not seen for thousands of years. There were no historical chronicles about those times, and the legends were never accurate. Seth looked out into the hallway again. One of the guards noticed him and immediately shouted loudly, pointing in his direction. Seth made sure they had a good look at him, then dove back down. He took a deep breath as he ran, drawing stormlight from the lanterns. His body came to life, his speed increased, his muscles were filled with ebullient energy. Inside him, the light turned into a storm, blood thundered in his ears. It was terrible and wonderful at the same time. 2 corridors leading straight, one to the side. He opened the pantry door, then paused for a second, long enough for the guard to run around the corner and see him, then he jumped into the room. Preparing for full entanglement, he raised his hand and commanded stormlight to fill it, his skin lighting up with a glow. Then he threw his hand towards the frame, spraying it with a white glow, like paint. The door slammed shut the same moment the guards appeared. Stormlight propped the door open with the strength of 100 hands. The four weave bound objects together and held tightly until Stormlight ended. It took more time to create, and Stormlight was depleted much faster than with the main plexus. The door shook, then the wood cracked as the guards leaned on it with all their weight. Someone shouted for an axe. Seth crossed the room with quick steps, slipping among the furniture stored here. It was made of expensive wood and wrapped in red cloth. He reached the far wall and, preparing himself for another sacrilege, raised the blade of shards and made a horizontal cut in the grey stone. The wall gave way easily. The blade of shards could cut any inanimate object. Then came two vertical cuts, then another at their base. Seth ended up cutting out a large square block. He pressed his hand against it, releasing Stormlight into the stone. Wood chips flew from the door behind him. He looked over his shoulder and, concentrating on the shaking door, dragged a stone block to it. His clothes were covered in frost. The weave of such large objects required a huge amount of stormlight. The storm inside him subsided, as if the storm had given way to a gentle rain. He stepped aside. A very heavy stone block shuddered and slid towards the door. Under normal conditions, the block would not have moved. The gigantic weight would have held it on the stones. But now his own weight was dragging him down, and down for him was the door of the room. With a deep grinding sound, he pulled himself free from the wall and tumbled through the air, smashing furniture. The soldiers finally broke down the door and burst inside. And at the same instant a huge block of stone fell on them. Seth turned his back to the terrible screams, the crack of splintering wood and breaking bones, then bent down and stepped through the new hole, emerging into the outer corridor. He walked slowly, drawing stormlight from the lamps he passed and igniting a new storm within himself. The lamps dimmed and the corridor became darker. At the end was a massive wooden door. He walked up to it, and the fistmen, like balls of purple goo, began to squirm against the stonework, pointing in the direction of the doorway. They were attracted by the horror they felt on the other side of the door. Seth pushed the door open, entering the final corridor leading to the royal chambers. Tall red vases and excited soldiers lined his path. They stood on both sides of a long, narrow carpet, red like a river of blood. The leading spearman did not wait for him to come closer and ran towards him, taking short throwing spears at the ready. Seth slammed his hand to the side, pushing Stormlight into the frame and using the third and final type of weave reverse. It didn't work like the other two. The door frame did not emit stormlight. On the contrary, it seemed to absorb him, creating a strange twilight. The spears flew towards their target, but Seth stood motionless, his hand pressed to the door frame. The reverse plexus required continuous contact, but took relatively little stormlight. And it attracted everything that came close to it, especially lighter objects. The spears changed direction and pierced the doorpost. Feeling the blow, Seth jumped into the air and entwined himself with the right wall, his feet slapping against the stone. The picture immediately changed. Now he stood on the floor and the soldiers on the wall, the blood-red carpet between them like a long tapestry. Seth rushed down the corridor, cutting the necks of two of those who threw spears at him with the blade of shards along the way. Their eyes flashed and they fell dead. Volume 1 Chapter 0.3. Panic began among the other guards in the corridor. Some were still trying to attack, others were calling for help, and others were backing away from him. It was difficult for the attackers. They were disoriented by the unusual situation and the futility of trying to hit the one who was running along the wall. Seth cut off several guards, jumped into the air, turned over and again entwined himself with the floor. He landed among the soldiers, completely surrounded, but with the blade of shards in his hands. According to legend, the shard blades were originally wielded by the Knights Radiant many, many years ago. These were gifts from their god, which he gave them to fight against terrible creatures of stone and fire, dozens of feet tall, and with eyes blazing with hatred. Bringers of the void. If your enemy's skin is as hard as stone, steel is useless. Something different, supernatural, was required. Seth jumped off the wall and stood up, his loose white clothes fluttering, his jaw clenching. Sinner. He hit. The blade flashed in the torchlight. Powerful, wide strokes. 3, one after the other. He could not cover his ears and not hear the screams. He could not close his eyes and not see the falling people. They fell around him like toys knocked over by a child's careless kick. If the blade touched a person's back, he died and his eyes burned out. If it cut through an arm or leg, it killed the limb. One of the soldiers hobbled away from Seth, his arm flailing uselessly. He will never be able to feel her and own her. Seth lowered a blade of shards, standing among the cold black-eyed corpses. Here in Alethka, legends were often told of the hard-fought victory of humans over the Voidbringers. But when weapons designed to fight nightmares are turned against ordinary soldiers, human life plummets in value. Seth turned and walked on, his feet sliding along the soft red carpet. The blade of shards was clean and shining silver, as always. When you kill with the blade, there is no blood. Perhaps this is a sign that the Blade of Shards is only a tool and cannot be accused of murder. The door at the end of the corridor swung open. Seth froze as he saw a small group of soldiers accompanying a man in royal robes, who lowered his head as if arrows were whistling around him. The soldiers wore dark blue, the color of the royal guard. The mountain of corpses did not even make them flinch. They were ready for what the shard bearer could do. The monarch disappeared behind a side door. The guards turned their spears towards Seth. And from the royal chambers came another figure, dressed in shining armor of smoothly overlapping plates. But, unlike ordinary armor, this one had no skin or visible joints, only hundreds of small plates, adjacent to one another with amazing precision. The armor is beautiful blue, with golden lay on the edges of each plate. The helmet was decorated with 3 waves of small horn-shaped wings. Shard armor, a common addition to the shard blade. The newcomer held a sword in his hand, a huge blade of shards the size of a man with an ornament similar to flashes of fire. The silvery metal glittered and seemed to glow from within. A weapon designed to kill the dark gods, a duplicate of the one Seth carried, only larger. Seth hesitated. He didn't recognize the armor, he was not warned about them, and there is no time to remember the various armor and blades that the Alethi owned. But the bearer of shards will have to be dealt with before the king. Seth could not leave such an enemy behind. Besides, maybe the shard bearer would win and end his miserable life. Maybe his tangles won't directly affect someone wearing shard armor. Armor improves a person's abilities, making him much stronger. Seth's code of honor does not allow him to betray the mission or seek death. But if death itself finds him, he will only welcome it. The unknown knight struck, and Seth, entwining himself with the wall of the corridor, somersaulted, landed on the wall and danced back, holding the blade at the ready. The bearer of the shards prepared for a new attack, taking one of the stances used here in the east. He moved much more quickly than could be expected from a man in such heavy armor. The shard armor was special, as ancient and magical as the blades it came with. The bearer of shards struck again. Seth slid to the side and intertwined himself with the ceiling, while his opponent's blade sliced through the wall. Feeling the excitement of the duel, Seth rushed forward and struck downwards, trying to hit the helmet of the bearer of shards. The warrior fell to his knee, and the blade of Seth pierced the empty air. The shard bearer struck upward. Seth instantly jumped back, and the blade pierced the ceiling. Seth did not have armor, and he did not want to own it. His weaves conflicted with the gems that gave power to the armor, and he had to choose one or the other. As the shard bearer turned around, Seth rushed forward along the ceiling. As expected, the knight swung his blade again, and Seth jumped to the side, rolled and jumped into the air, weaving himself into the floor. He landed behind the shard bearer and brought the blade down on his opponent's exposed back. The armor gave the warrior one serious advantage. The blade did not penetrate it, at least not the first time. Seth's weapon hit hard and accurately, and a web of glowing lines appeared on the back of the armor, through which stormlight poured. Shard armor did not bend or crumple like regular metal. Seth needed to hit at least one more time in the Seth danced backwards, avoiding the shard bearer's furious blow aimed at his knees. The storm within Seth gave him many advantages, including the ability to quickly recover from minor wounds. But it will not restore legs damaged by the blade of shards. He circled around the shard bearer, chose his moment and rushed forward. The knight slashed again, but at the same moment Seth intertwined himself with the ceiling, flew into the air, flew over the sword, and immediately intertwined himself with the floor. Having landed, he instantly attacked, but the bearer of shards had already recovered and struck back, missing him literally by a finger. The man wielded the blade too well and dangerously. Many shard bearers relied too much on the strength of their weapons and armor. This one is not one of those. Seth jumped towards the wall and attacked the shard bearer with quick short strikes, similar to the throws of a sky eel. The knight countered with wide, no less fast swings. The length of his blade kept Seth at bay. Too long, thought Seth. If the king escapes, Seth will fail the mission no matter how many people die. He ducked for the next blow, but the shard bearer forced him back. With every second the king runs further and further. It's time to go crazy. Seth threw himself into the air, intertwined himself with a point at the opposite end of the corridor, and began to fall onto the enemy feet first. The shard bearer struck without hesitation, but Seth weaved himself from a different angle and instantly descended. The enemy's blade cut the air above him. Seth landed on his haunches and, using his momentum, rushed forward and hit the shard bearer in the side, where the armor cracked. The plate split, particles of molten metal scattered around. The knight wheezed and fell to his knee, pressing his palm to the wound. Seth, gathering the strength of the storm raging within, launched a kick. The heavy bearer of shards flew towards the doors to the king's chambers, broke them and fell deep into the room. Seth left him and ducked through the door on the right through which the king had emerged. This corridor was covered with the same red carpet, and the lamps with stormlight gave Seth the opportunity to feed the storm within himself. The energy flared up in him again, he walked faster. If he quickly deals with the king, he will be able to return and finish the duel with the bearer of shards. It won't be easy. A full weave on a doorway will not stop the shard bearer, and the armor will allow him to run supernaturally fast. Seth looked back. Nobody was following him. Seth could see it. The shard bearer looked shocked, sitting in the doorway, surrounded by broken pieces of wood. Perhaps Seth had hurt him more than he thought. End of chapter. Volume 1 Chapter 0.4. Or, Seth froze in place. He remembered the bowed head of the man who had been taken out of his chambers and his covered face. The knight did not even think of giving chase. But he was so skilled. It was said that few could match Gavilar Collins' skill with the sword. Maybe. Seth turned and ran back, trusting his instincts. The bearer of the shards, seeing him, quickly rose to his feet. Seth ran faster. Which place is safest for the king? Surrounded by a bunch of guards, or under the protection of the shard armor, left behind as an ordinary bodyguard? Clever, Seth thought, watching how the shard bearer, who had barely moved until recently, took a fighting stance. Seth attacked with renewed strength, spinning the blade in a flurry of blows. The bearer of the shards, the king, responded aggressively with wide, fast swings. Seth walked away from one of them, feeling the wind from the sword as it passed within an inch of him. He timed his next move and rushed forward, passing under the king's next swing. The king, expecting another blow to his side, arched his hand, preparing to protect the hole in the armor. This allowed Seth to sneak past him into the royal chambers. The king turned to pursue, but Seth was already running through the richly decorated room, touching the furniture that came his way. He poured stormlight into them, weaving with a point behind the king. It was as if the room had been turned on its side. The furniture swayed, and all these chairs, sofas, tables began to fall on the amazed king. Gavilar made the mistake of deciding to cut them with the blade of shards. The sword easily cut through the large sofa, but its parts still hit him, causing him to stagger. The next thing that hit the king was a chair, throwing him to the floor. Gavilar rolled out of the way of the furniture and rushed forward, streams of light flowing from the holes in his armor. Seth braced himself and leapt into the air, weaving himself back and to the right of the approaching king. After avoiding the king's strike, he weaved himself forward with 2 successive core weaves. Stormlight burst out of him, his clothes froze, but he began to fall on the king with double speed. The king was frankly confused when Seth first swayed in the air in front of him and then spun towards him and hit him. Having brought the blade down on the king's helmet, Seth immediately entwined himself with the ceiling and soared upward, hitting the stone arches. He weaved himself too often and too quickly, his body became disorientated, causing him to land less than gracefully. He stumbled to his feet. Below, the king stepped back, trying to get into a good position to strike. His helmet was cracked, stormlight streamed from it, covering his side with a broken plate. The king, holding the sword with one hand, swung it, trying to reach the enemy standing on the ceiling. Seth immediately braided himself down, reasoning that this attack would prevent the king from returning the sword in time. Seth underestimated his opponent. The king stepped under Seth's blow, trusting that the helmet would not fail. After the second hit, the helmet shattered, but Gavilar contrived and, with the gauntleted fist of his free hand, punched Seth in the face. Blinding pain flashed in Seth's eyes, his face twisted into a grimace of suffering. Everything around blurred as if in a fog. Pain? What intense pain? Seth screamed. Stormlight hurriedly exited him, and his back hit something hard. Balcony doors. Even more pain tore through his shoulders, as if someone had stabbed him with 100 knives. He fell to the ground, rolled and stopped, his muscles shaking. Such a blow would kill an ordinary person on the spot. Don't think about pain. Don't think about pain. Don't think about pain. He squinted, shaking his head, the world becoming dark and blurry. Is he blind? No. This is the darkness of the night. He is on a wooden balcony. The force of the blow threw him out of the doors. Something is rumbling. Heavy steps. Bearer of shards. Seth struggled to his feet, the world swimming before his eyes. Blood was running down his face, stormlight was streaming from his skin, and his left eye couldn't see anything. Light. He will heal him if he can. His lower jaw dropped. Broken. He threw the blade of shards. A clumsy shadow moved in front of him. So much stormlight flowed through the armor of shards that it was difficult for the king to walk. But he was getting closer. Seth screamed, fell to his knees and poured stormlight into the wooden balcony, weaving it. The air around him froze. The storm roared, going down his hands into the tree. He weaved it again and again. And on the fourth, when Gavilar appeared on the balcony, staggering under a terrible weight. The tree is cracked. The bearer of the shards hesitated. Seth weaved the balcony for the 5th time. The beams holding up the balcony shattered into pieces, and the entire structure was separated from the building. Seth screamed triumphantly through his broken jaw, and with the last ray of stormlight, entwined himself with the building. He began to fall, rushed past the stricken shard bearer, hit the wall and rolled. The balcony fell down. The shocked king looked up at Seth. He could no longer walk. The fall was short-lived. In the light of the moon, Seth watched gloomily with one eye as the balcony with the king hit the stone below. The palace wall shook, the crack of broken wood reverberating off the neighboring buildings. Seth, still entangled with the wall, rose to his feet with a groan. He felt weak. He had used up stormlight too quickly and had no strength left. He climbed down the wall with difficulty and approached the rubble. The king was still moving. His armor protected him from the fall, but a long bloody piece of debris stuck into his side, where Seth had made a hole earlier. Seth knelt down next to him and looked into his face, twisted in pain. Strong features, square chin, salt and pepper beard, wonderful pale green eyes. Gavilar Colin. I was waiting for you to come, the king breathed out with difficulty. Seth moved his hand under the front plate of the armor, feeling for the straps. They came undone and he removed the king's chest plates, revealing the jewels. 2 crystals cracked and went out, but 3 still sparkled. Seth breathed in the light with difficulty. Again a storm raged inside him. Light streamed from the face, healing the torn skin and broken bones. However, the pain did not go away. Stormlight did not heal instantly. It would take a few hours for it to fully recover. The king coughed. You can tell to Dacre that he's late. I don't know who this is, Seth said, standing up, the words coming out of his broken mouth with difficulty. He extended his hand, summoning the blade of shards. Then who? The king frowned. Restes. Sadis. I never thought. The Parshendi ordered me, Seth said. 10 heartbeats, and the blade was in his hand, with droplets of moisture all over the blade. Parshendi. It does not make sense. Gavilar coughed again. His hand was shaking, but he stretched it to his chest, reached into his pocket with his fingers, and pulled out a small crystal sphere on a chain. Take it. Let them not get it. He seemed stunned. Tell my brother he must find the most important words a man can say. Gavilar fell silent. Seth hesitated, then finally knelt down and took the sphere. Very unusual, he had never seen anything like it before. Completely dark, but glowing. Black light. Parshendi. It does not make sense. Gavilar's last words. Nothing makes sense anymore, Seth whispered, hiding the strange sphere. No one can unravel. Sorry, King of the Alethi. I doubt you care. At least not now. He got up. And at least you won't see the world disappear along with us all. The blade of shards, belonging to Gavilar Colin, materialized from the fog. It fell next to the king's body and rang on the stones. It costs a fortune. Kingdoms fell only because of competition for the blade of shards. Cries of alarm from the palace. Seth has to go. But, tell my brother. For the people of Set, the will of the dying is sacred. He took the king's hand, dipped it in blood and wrote on the tree with it. Brother, you must find the most important words a man can say. And Seth disappeared into the night. He didn't take the royal shard blade, there's no point. The blade of Set himself is a sufficient curse. Volume 1 Chapter 1. You killed me. Bastards, you killed me. The sun hasn't cooled down yet, and I'm dying. Received on the 5th day of the week of Chach in the month of Betab, 1171, 10 seconds before death. The subject is a dark-eyed soldier, 31 years old. The source is dubious. 5 years later. Am I going to die? Asked Ken. The seasoned warrior standing nearby looked him up and down. The veteran had a thick, short-cropped beard. The black hair at the temples began to give way to grey hair. I'm going to die, Ken thought, clutching his spear. The shaft had become slippery with sweat. I will die. O father of storms. I will die. How old are you, son? Asked the veteran. Ken didn't remember his name. It is difficult to remember anything at all when an alien army is lining up in battle formation behind a rocky field. The formation seemed somehow civilian. Neat, organized. Soldiers with short spears in the front ranks, with long spears and javelins in the rear, and archers on the flanks. The equipment of the dark-eyed spearman was the same as that of Ken. A leather jacket, a knee-length skirt, a simple steel helmet and the same armor. Most light eyes wore full armor. They sat astride horses, surrounded by their honor guards, whose armor gleamed burgundy and deep forest green. Are there shard bearers among them? Brightlord Amram is not a shard bearer. Maybe one of his people. And what if Ken has to fight one of them? An ordinary person cannot defeat the shard bearer. This happened so rarely that each such incident became a legend. This is for real, he thought with growing horror. No drill in the camp. Not training with sticks in the field. This is all for real. Let's face the facts. The heart is beating in the chest like a frightened animal in a cage. The legs are giving way. Ken suddenly realized that he was a coward. He shouldn't have abandoned his flocks. He should never have. Son. The veteran repeated persistently. How old are you? 15, sir. What's your name? Ken, sir. The bearded giant nodded. And I'm Dalit. Dalit, Ken repeated, without taking his eyes off the enemy army. How many of them are there? Thousands. I'm going to die, right? No. Dalit's voice was rough, and for some reason it was calming. You'll be fine. Don't lose your head. Stick with the platoon. But I haven't trained for 3 months. The recruit could swear he heard a faint ringing sound coming from enemy armor or shields. I can barely hold a spear. Father of Storms, I'm already dead. I can't. Son, Dalit interrupted him softly but decisively, placing his hand on Ken's shoulder. The rim of his shield flashed from behind him. You'll be fine. How do you know? It sounded like a plea. From there, guy. You are in Kaladin's Stormbalist's squad. The soldiers nearby nodded in agreement. Behind them, chain by chain, 1,000 soldiers formed battle formations. Ken was at the forefront of Kaladin's platoon of about 30 men. Why was Ken transferred to a new squad at the very last moment? This is already in the realm of camp politics. And why was their detachment placed at the very front line, where the losses would be the heaviest? Fispren, like balls of purple goo, began to rise from the ground and accumulate at his feet. At some point, panic reached its apogee. The young warrior was ready to throw his spear and shoot him. Dalit's hand squeezed his shoulder. Looking into Dalit's confident black eyes, Ken hesitated. Do you want to take a leak before we line up? Dalit asked. There is no time for. Let's do now. Right here. If you don't do it now, your leg will bleed during the fight, you'll get distracted, and then they'll kill you. Let's. Confused, Ken handed Dalit a spear and relieved himself directly on the stones. Having finished, he stole a glance at those standing nearby. None of Kaladin's soldiers smirked. They stood calmly, holding spears at their sides, shields thrown behind their backs. The enemies are almost finished forming. The two armies were separated by a barren flat rocky wasteland, surprisingly smooth, only here and there lonely stone buds growing on it. You can make a good pasture here. A warm wind blew into Ken's face, saturated with the smells of moisture from the superstorm that raged last night. Dalit. Someone's voice called out. A man walked through the ranks with a short spear in his hands, to the shaft of which were tied leather sheaths for 2 daggers. The stranger was young, perhaps 4 years older than 15-year-old Ken, but several fingers taller than Dalit himself. He wore the usual leather armor of a spearman, with a pair of dark trousers visible from under the skirt. It doesn't seem to be allowed. Typical Alethi black hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, dark brown eyes. On the shoulders of the jacket there are knots of white cord, the sign of the platoon commander. The 30 men next to Ken stood at attention, spears raised in salute. And is this Kaladin's Stormbalist? Ken thought incredulously. This young man. Dalit, a new recruit will approach now, Kaladin said in a strong voice. I want you to. He paused when he noticed Ken. Just a few minutes ago he found us, Sir, Dalit said with a smile. I put him in line. Great, Kaladin said. I paid well to take this boy from Gar. He turned out to be so ignorant that this Ken could well have fought on the other side. What? Thought Ken. Why would anyone pay for me? What can you say about this field? Kaladin asked. Several spearmen nearby immediately began to peer into the rocks, shielding their eyes from the sun with their hands. That hollow between the boulders on the right flank. Dalit asked. Kaladin nodded affirmatively. Too hard to get to? Yes. Perhaps. What about the little hill over there? Far enough to avoid the first strike, close enough to avoid going too far ahead. Kaladin nodded, although Ken still didn't understand what they saw there. Good. Hey, idiots, did you hear? Dalit shouted. Everyone threw their spears up. Keep an eye on the new guy, Dalit, Kaladin said. He doesn't know the signals. Of course, Dalit said, smiling. Smiling? How could this man smile? Horns sounded in the enemy army. So are they ready? Even though Ken had relieved himself, a trickle of urine ran down his leg. Don't relax, Kaladin said and rushed along the front line to talk with the commander of the neighboring platoon. Dozens of lines were still forming behind Ken and his new comrades. The archers on the flanks prepared to fire. Calm down, son, Dalit said. We'll be fine. Kaladin is always lucky. The soldier standing next to Ken nodded. A lanky red-haired Vedan with darker skin than the Alethi. What did he forget in the Alethi army? Exactly. Kaladin is storm-blessed, that's for sure. In the last battle we lost one. But someone was killed, said Ken. Dalit shrugged. People die all the time. Our platoon had the least casualties. You see. Kaladin ended his meeting with the other commander and ran back to his team. In one hand he held a short spear, which means that in the other there would be a shield, but it was a palm longer than the others. For battle, guys, Dalit commanded. Unlike other commanders, Kaladin did not crowd into the ranks, but stood in front of his platoon. The people around Ken moved excitedly. The same sounds were repeated throughout the army. Calm gave way to impatience. Hundreds of feet shuffled, shields rang, buckles clicked. Kaladin remained motionless, keeping his eyes on the enemy army. Volume 1 Chapter 2. Attention, he said without turning around. The light-eyed officer galloped up from somewhere behind. Prepare for battle. Let's bleed them, guys. Fight and kill. Attention, Kaladin repeated after he had left. Get ready to run, Dalit told Kennu. Run. But we were taught to march in formation. Stay in line. Naturally, said Dalit. But most people have no more experience than you. Those who can fight well are eventually sent to the Shattered Plains to fight the Parshendi. Kaladin is trying to get us in shape to go out there and fight for the king. Dalit nodded along the line. Most of them will not be able to stand it and will run into the attack. The light-eyed ones are not such good commanders and will not keep them in the ranks. So stay with us and run. Why shouldn't I get a shield? With the exception of Kaladin's platoon, all ranks have already had their shields unhooked. But in this squad, the shields remained behind their backs. Dalit did not have time to answer. Horn sounded from behind. Forward. Dalit commanded. Ken didn't have much of a choice. The whole army began to move, thousands of feet stamped. As Dalit predicted, the formation did not last long. Some people started screaming and others took up the roar. The light-eyed ones called to go, run, fight. The ranks broke up. As soon as this happened, Kaladin's squad rushed forward at full speed. Ken, stupefied with wild terror, tried to keep up. The ground was not at all as smooth as it seemed at first, and he almost fell, tripping over an unnoticed stone bud, the vines of which were hidden in the shell. Straightening up, he ran on, holding his spear in one hand, his shield slapping against his back. Another army also began to move, its soldiers scattered across the field. There were no battle formations or ranks left. Nothing like what they were told during training. Ken didn't even know who their enemy was. The landlord trespassed on the territory of Brightlord Amram, although this land ultimately belonged to Crown Prince Sadius. This was a border skirmish with the neighboring Alethi Principality. Why would they fight each other? The king might have put an end to this, but he waged war on the Shattered Plains, seeking revenge for the murder of King Gavilar 5 years ago. The enemies had many archers. As soon as the first wave of arrows flew into the air, Ken's panic reached its limit. He stumbled again, his hands itching to take out his shield and hide behind it. But Dalit grabbed him by the hand and pulled him forward. Hundreds of arrows streaked across the sky, eclipsing the sun. They reached the top and swooped down like sky eels towards their prey. Amram's soldiers raised their shields. But not Kaladin's platoon. Shields are not for them. Ken screamed. The arrows struck the central ranks of Amram's army behind him. Ken looked back as he ran. The soldiers screamed, arrows broke on their shields. Only a few stray arrows fell close to the front ranks. Why? He shouted to Dalit. How did you know? They shoot where there are most people, answered the giant. Where any arrow will find a body. A few groups in the vanguard lowered their shields, but most ran clumsily with their shields raised to the sky. As a result, they moved more slowly and risked being trampled by those pressing from behind. And yet, Ken really wanted to grab the shield. It was scary to run without it. The second volley hit, people screamed in pain. Kaladin's platoon got so close to the enemy that Ken saw enemy soldiers fall, struck by the arrows of Amram's archers, heard their battle cry, and distinguished individual faces. Suddenly the platoon stopped and the soldiers stood in a tight group. They had just reached the gentle slope that Kaladin and Dalit had chosen in advance. Dalit grabbed Ken and pushed him into the very center of the group. Kaladin's men lowered their spears and covered themselves with shields, just as the enemy fell upon them. The attackers did not have time to restore the battle formation, long spears in the back ranks, short ones in the front. They all just ran forward, screaming in a frenzy. Ken fiddled with the shield, trying to get it from behind his back. The sound of spears rang through the air as the two squads clashed. They were attacked by a group of enemy spearmen, apparently wanting to take the heights. The 3 attackers had some semblance of order, although they did not form as tight a formation as Kaladin's platoon. The enemies seemed determined to get to Ken at any cost. With roars and furious screams, they launched a frontal attack. However, Kaladin's platoon held on, protecting Ken as if he were light-eyed, and they were his honor guard. The two forces collided, metal hitting wood, shields hitting shields. Ken cowered in fear. Everything took no more than a few moments. The enemy retreated, leaving 2 dead men on the stones. There were no casualties in Kaladin's squad. They continued to form a bristling V, although one of the soldiers stepped back and took out a bandage to cover a wound on his thigh. The rest closed ranks. The huge big-armed soldier cursed, but the wound turned out to be minor. A minute later the warrior was already on his feet but did not return to his place. Instead, he stood in the most protected place at the base of the wedge-shaped formation. Chaos reigned on the battlefield. The two armies completely mixed up, the air was filled with ringing, creaking and frantic screams. Many of the detachments disintegrated, their fighters entered into one or another random skirmish. They moved like hounds, in groups of 3 or 4, looking for individuals, and brutally dealt with them. Kaladin's platoon remained stationary, engaging only those units that were nearby. Is this how things are supposed to happen during battle? In his training, Ken was trained to fight in a long line, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. But not to this mad mess, to this utter hell. Why isn't anyone holding the line anymore? Because all the real soldiers are gone, Ken thought. Off to fight the real war on the shattered plains. No wonder Kaladin wants to go there. Spears flashed everywhere, it was difficult to distinguish friend from foe, despite the badges on the armor and the color of the shields. The armies scattered into hundreds of small groups, each of which fought its own war. After the first few skirmishes, Dalinar grabbed Ken by the shoulder and forced him into line at the very base of the V formation. Ken, however, was of no use. Once Kaladin's team engaged enemy forces, everything he had been taught went out the window. He could only stand still, lowering his spear and trying to look menacing. For almost an hour, Kaladin's platoon held its height, acting courageously and harmoniously. Kaladin changed his position frequently and darted back and forth, beating a strange rhythm with his spear against his shield. Signals. Ken realized as the platoon changed from a V-shaped wedge into a ring. Against the background of the screams of thousands of fighting warriors and the groans of the dying, it was absolutely impossible to hear the voice of an individual. And the sharp clank of the spear on the metal plate of Kaladin's shield was heard very clearly. Every time the signal sounded, Dalinar grabbed Ken by the shoulder and put him in the right place. Kaladin's warriors did not pursue the retreaters. The platoon held the line. Small groups of the enemy bypassed them, and larger ones, after exchanging a few blows, moved away, looking for easier prey. Although several soldiers were injured, no one was killed. Eventually a turning point came. Kaladin kept spinning, watching the ebb and flow of the battle with his piercing brown eyes. Suddenly he raised his spear and pounded the shield in a fast rhythm that he had never used before. Dalinar grabbed Ken by the arm and pulled him away from the hill. Why are they leaving the position? And at the same moment, most of the soldiers of Amram's army rushed in all directions. Ken didn't realize how bad things were going in this area until he was nearby. As Kaladin's platoon retreated, they found wounded and dying everywhere. The soldiers were literally gutted, their entrails spilling out. Nausea rose in Ken's throat. Volume 1 Chapter 3. But there was no time to be horrified, the retreat soon turned into a disorderly flight. Dalinar cursed, and Kaladin pounded the shield again. The squad turned, heading east. There, as Ken saw, a large group of Amram's soldiers was still holding out. However, the enemy saw gaps in their ranks and became bolder. The enemy packs rushed forward like wild thunderhounds hunting pigs. Halfway across the corpse-strewn field, Kaladin's command was intercepted by superior enemy forces. Kaladin reluctantly struck the shield, the squad slowed down. Ken felt his heart beating faster and faster. A detachment of Amram's soldiers was dying nearby, people stumbled, fell, screamed, tried to escape. Enemies knocked soldiers down and impaled them on spears like crumlings. Kaladin's men met the enemy, spears and shields thundering. People were falling from all sides, and Ken did not know what to do. In the crush of friends and enemies, murderers and their victims, Ken finally lost his own. So many people rushing here and there. He panicked, looking for a safe place. A group of soldiers nearby wore Amram's uniform. Kaladin's platoon. Ken rushed towards them, but when some turned to him, he realized with horror that he did not recognize anyone. This was not Kaladin's squad, but a small group of unfamiliar soldiers trying to hold an uneven, broken formation. Wounded and frightened, they fled as soon as the enemy squad approached them. Ken froze, holding the spear in his sweaty palm. Enemy soldiers were rushing straight towards him. Instinct ordered him to save himself, but he had already seen how many people were killed one by one. He must survive. He must meet them face to face. He shouldn't run, he shouldn't. He screamed as he swung his spear at the soldier running ahead. He carelessly batted the weapon away with his shield and plunged the short spear into Ken's thigh. The pain was burning, so burning that the blood that spurted from the wound seemed cold in comparison. Ken gasped. The soldier easily pulled out his weapon. Ken swayed and fell backwards, dropping his spear and shield. He fell on rocky ground, sprinkled with someone else's blood. His opponent, a shadowy silhouette against the completely blue sky, raised his spear high, preparing to plunge it into Ken's heart. And then he came. Squad leader. Blessed by the storm, Kaladin's spear appeared out of nowhere, deflecting the blow that should have killed Ken. Kaladin stood before Ken, alone, facing 6 spearmen. He didn't flinch. He attacked them. Everything happened very quickly. Kaladin knocked down the soldier who had wounded Ken. Before the man could fall, Kaladin snatched the knife from the sheath tied to the spear. The knife flashed in the air and pierced the second soldier's thigh. He screamed and fell to one knee. The third froze in place, looking at his defeated comrades. Kaladin pushed the wounded enemy aside and plunged his spear into the third soldier's stomach. The fourth fell down with a knife in his eye. When did Kaladin snatch it? He spun between the last two soldiers, using his spear as a club. The spear became a blur, and for a moment Ken thought he saw something surrounding the commander. There was some kind of curvature of the air, as if the wind had become visible. I lost a lot of blood, it flows out so quickly. Kaladin twisted, lunging sideways, and the last two spearmen fell with a gurgling sound that Ken assumed must have been a sign of surprise. With all his enemies dispatched, Kaladin turned and knelt in front of Ken. The commander put down his spear, took a strip of white cloth from his pocket, and tightly bandaged Ken's leg. Kaladin did this with the ease of a man who had bandaged his wounds a dozen times before. Be careful, sir," Ken shouted and pointed to one of the soldiers Kaladin had wounded. He stood up, holding his leg. But within a second the giant Darlot was then pushed the enemy away with his shield. Darlot did not kill the wounded man, he only disarmed him, and he limped away. The rest of the platoon appeared and formed a ring around Kaladin, Darlot, and Ken. Kaladin stood up, throwing his spear over his shoulder. Darlot returned to him the knives taken from the killed enemies. "You have me worried, sir," Darlot said. So they rushed. "I knew you wouldn't be left behind," Kaladin replied. Raised the red flag. "Kin, Corridor, you will go with the boy. Darlot, you will stay here. The Amarama line arches in our direction. We'll be safe soon." "And you, sir?" Darlot asked. Kaladin looked around the field. The enemy ranks parted, and from there, riding a white horse, rode out a horseman, waving a spiked mace. He wore full armor, polished and shining silver. "Bearer of shards," Ken exclaimed. Darlot snorted. "No, praise be to the Father of Storms. An ordinary light-eyed officer. Shard carriers are too valuable to be used in a run-of-the-mill border conflict." Kaladin looked at the light eyes with seething hatred. The same hatred appeared on the face of Ken's father when he talked about the Cholothiefs, or on his mother's when someone mentioned Kasiri, who ran off with the cobbler's son. "What are you up to, sir?" Darlot asked. "Squads 2 and 3, form claw formation," Kaladin said, his voice firm. "Let's throw the Brightlord off the throne." "Is this reasonable, sir? We have wounded." Kaladin turned to Darlot. "This is one of the Hallau officers. Maybe he himself. You don't know that for sure, sir." In any case, he is at least a battalion lord. If we shoot an officer of this rank, all of us with the next batch are guaranteed to be sent to the Shattered Plains. Let's do it." His eyes became distant. Just imagine, Darlot. Real soldiers. Discipline in a military camp and honest light-eyed people. A place where fighting makes sense. Darlot nodded in agreement with a sigh. Kaladin waved to a group of his soldiers, who ran across the field. Another smaller group, including Darlot, remained with the wounded man. One of the soldiers, a thin Alethi with black hair that was clearly streaked with blond streaks indicating a mixture of other blood, took a long red ribbon from his pocket and attached it to his spear. The warrior raised his spear higher, and the ribbon fluttered in the wind. "This is a signal for our messengers to carry the wounded man out of the field," Darlot explained to Kenna. "They'll take you away now. And you are a daredevil, you came out 1 against 6. "It seems stupid to run," Ken said, trying to distract himself from the pain throbbing in his leg. "There are so many wounded on the field, why will the messengers come to us?" "Kaladin is bribing them," Darlot said. "Our commander spends most of his salary on bribes. Typically they only carry off light eyes, but there are more messengers here than there are wounded light eyes. This squad is not like the others," Ken said, feeling dizzy. What did I say? But not because of luck. Because of the preparation. This is partly true. And to a certain extent, because we know that if we get wounded, Kaladin will carry us off the battlefield." He fell silent, looking over his shoulder. As their commander had predicted, Amram's army poured back, leveling the front line. The enemy light-eyed horseman continued to vigorously swing his mace. His honor guard moved to the side, engaging Kaladin's squads. Light Eyes turned his horse. He wore a visorless helmet with rounded cheek pieces and a large tuft of feathers on top. Ken could not see the color of his eyes, but he knew that, as befits a Brightlord, chosen at birth by the heralds and marked with the seal of power, his eyes should be blue or green, or perhaps yellow or light gray. The officer looked dispassionately at those who were fighting nearby, and then Kaladin miraculously slipped past the combatants and jumped at him, raising his spear. The Brightlord screamed, falling from the saddle as one of Kaladin's knives pierced his right eye. "Yes, partly because of the preparation," Darlot continued, shaking his head. "But mostly because of him. He fights like a storm, yeah, and he thinks twice as fast as others. And sometimes it moves like this. Volume 1 Chapter 4. He bandaged my leg, Ken said, realizing that due to the loss of blood he was beginning to talk nonsense. He was given this leg. Bandaging is quite simple. Dalinar nodded. He knows a lot about wounds. He can also read glyphs. Our commander is a strange man, very strange for a simple dark-eyed spearman. He turned to Ken. Save your strength, son. The commander wouldn't be happy if we lose you, especially considering how much he paid for you. Why? Asked Ken. The battlefield became quieter, as if most of the dying had already lost their voices from screaming. There were only his own people around, but Dalinar was on guard, fearing that enemy soldiers would try to attack the wounded man. Why, Dalinar? Ken repeated insistently. Why did he take me into his platoon? Why me? Dalinar shook his head. That's what he's all about. He hates the idea of green boys like you, belly-trained, being thrown into battle. From time to time he looks out for one yellowthroat and brings him to his platoon. More than half a dozen of us were once like you. Dalinar's gaze became clouded. It seems to me that you all remind him of someone. Ken examined his wound. Paintsprints swirled around him, little orange hands with two long fingers gripping his leg. They had already begun to leave the warrior's body, rushing to other places, looking for other wounded. The pain went away, his leg and his whole body went numb. Ken rolled over onto his back, staring at the sky. There was a faint sound of thunder. Strange. The sky is clear. Dalinar swore. Ken turned, coming out of his daze. A rider on a huge black horse, wearing shining armor that seemed to be emitting light itself, was galloping straight towards them. The armor was solid, no seams, only small, incredibly intricate plates. Full helmet without decorations and gilded armor. In one hand there is a huge sword, the length of a man. But not a simple straight sword, but a curved one, with a wavy blunt side of the blade and engraving along the entire length. The knight was wonderful. Like a work of art. Ken had never seen the shard bearer before, but he immediately knew it was him. How could he mistake a simple armed light-eyed for one of these majestic creatures? Wasn't it Dalinar who said that the bearer of shards would not be on the field? The veteran jumped to his feet, ordering the squad to line up. Because of his injured leg, all Ken could do was sit up. I felt very dizzy. How much blood did he lose? He could barely think. In any case, he was incapable of fighting. It is impossible to fight such an enemy. The sun shone on the armor. And this magnificent intricate sword. It's like the Almighty stepping onto the battlefield. And who would want to cross swords with the Almighty? Ken closed his eyes. 10 orders. Once upon a time you loved us. O Almighty, why have you forgotten us? A fragment of my soul, where have you gone? Received on the second day of Kakash, 1171, 5 seconds before death. The subject is a light-eyed woman no older than 30. 8 months later. Kaladin, his stomach growling, reached through the bars for a bowl of slop. He carried his small bowl more like a cup back through the bars, sniffed it, and winced. The dried remains of yesterday's food were mixed into a dirty grey gruel of overcooked thallium grains. It's disgusting, but there's nothing else. The mobile cage rolled on. He began to eat, dangling his legs through the bars and looking at the landscape passing by. The rest of the slaves clutched the bowls to themselves, afraid that someone would steal these crumbs. On the first day, one of them tried to steal Kaladin's portion. He almost broke the thief's arm. Now everyone left him alone. Which suited him just fine. He ate with his fingers, not paying attention to the dirt. He hadn't noticed her for months. The warrior could not allow paranoia to overcome him. Many captives were overtaken by a clouding of their minds. But how could one remain completely sane after 8 months of severe beatings and hunger? He will conquer madness. He won't be like them, even if there is no hope of escape. But he will keep one thing. Yes, he is a slave, but he will not think like a slave. Kaladin quickly finished the gruel. One of the slaves choked up next to him. There were 10 of them in the cage, all men, dirty, with unkempt beards. There are 3 cells in their caravan going through the no man's hills. The red and white sun burned on the horizon, like the hottest flame of a blacksmith's forge. Splashes of light poured through the clouds, carelessly thrown onto the heavenly canvas. The hills, covered with monotonous green grass, seemed endless. On the nearest hill a small figure danced, weightless and translucent, like a butterfly, fluttering around the plants. Windspren are wandering, malevolent spirits that like to hang out where they are not needed. Kaladin didn't expect this one to get tired and fly away, so he put his wooden bowl aside and pointed a finger at him. The Windspren, looking like a shapeless ribbon of light, laughed and dragged the bowl away. Kaladin cursed and grabbed her. Windspren often played pranks like this. Finally Kaladin took the bowl away. Grumbling, he tossed it to another slave. He quickly began to lick the remains of the gruel. Hey, someone's voice whispered. Kaladin looked back. A slave with dark unkempt hair crawled timidly toward him as if he expected Kaladin to be angry. You are not like others. The slave's black eyes looked up at Kaladin's forehead, onto which 3 glyphs were burned. The first 2 formed the brand. They were burned into him 8 months ago, on his last day in Amram's army. The third, completely fresh, he received from the most recent owner. Shash, that's what the last glyph meant. Dangerous. The slave hid his hand in rags. Knife? No, it's just funny. None of the slaves could have weapons. The leaves hidden in Kaladin's belt are the most he can possess. But it's not easy to let go of old instincts, and Kaladin kept looking at the hand. I overheard the guard's conversation. The slave continued, creeping closer. He had a tic, he blinked very often. It was about the fact that you have already tried to escape more than once. And one day you succeeded. Kaladin didn't answer. Look, said the slave, taking his hand out of his rags. There was a bowl of gruel in it, half full. Take me with you on your next escape, he whispered. And I'll give you half the portion until you get away. Please. The hunger spren flocked. They looked like small, barely visible brown flies hovering around the slave's head. Kaladin turned away, looking out at the endless hills and rolling grass. He placed one hand on the bars and pressed his head against it, his legs still hanging out. Well? Asked the man. You idiot, Kaladin whispered. If you give me half of your food, you will become too weak and will not be able to escape even if you try. And I won't try again. Useless. But 10 times, Kaladin whispered. 10 attempts in 8 months, from 5 different owners. Well, how many of them were successful? Well, if you're still here. 8 months. 8 months of slavery, 8 months of gruel and beatings. Eternity. He barely remembered the army. A slave cannot hide, Kaladin said. Especially a slave with those marks on his forehead. I ran away several times. But they always found me. And I found myself here again. People once called him lucky. Blessed by the storm. They were wrong, he was never lucky. Soldiers are a superstitious people, and although he objected from the very beginning, they called him that, and more as time went on. Anyone he tried to protect died. Again and again. And here he is, at the bottom of the abyss. It's better not to resist. It was his choice, he submitted. Volume 1 Chapter 5. And gained a certain freedom. Freedom to not care about anything. The slave finally realized that Kaladin would not say anything more, returned to his place, and began to finish the gruel. The van with the slaves rolled on. Green meadows stretched everywhere you looked. However, the ground around the rumbling van was completely bare. As soon as the wagon got closer, the grass disappeared. Each blade was pulled into a hole in the stone the size of a pinhead. The van drove by, and the grass timidly stuck out again, each blade of grass stretched towards the sun. It turned out that the cages with slaves were rolling along a lifeless stone road, cleared only for them. Here, far in the no man's hills, the superstorms were incredibly strong, and the plants learned to survive. We learned to do what everyone should be able to do: survive. Hold on despite the storm. The scent of another unwashed, sweaty body wafted over Kaladin, and his feet shuffled. He looked around warily, expecting to see the same slave. But no, it was a different person. With a long black beard, tangled, dirty, full of crumbs. Kaladin kept his beard short, allowing Dvalakwa's mercenaries to trim it from time to time. Like Kaladin, the slave wore a tattered brown sack and had, of course, dark eyes, perhaps dark green, it's hard to say. In this light they appeared brown or black. The newcomer cowered under Kaladin's gaze. He had a rash on one of his arms, the shape of a nickel of discolored skin. He probably approached because he saw Kaladin talking to the first one. Kaladin instilled fear in the slaves from day one, but they were drawn to him. Kaladin sighed and turned away. The slave sat down next to him hesitantly. Mind if I ask how you became a slave, friend? I can't help but wonder. We all want to know. The black-haired man, judging by his accent, was a Lethi, like Kaladin. Like most slaves. Kaladin didn't answer. For example, I kidnapped a herd of chullas, the man said in a hoarse voice, as if sheets of paper were rubbing against each other. If I had stolen one chulla, they would have simply beaten me. But the whole herd, 17 heads. He chuckled, admiring his own chutzpah. At the far end of the van, someone coughed again. The deplorable lot of slaves. Weak, sick, hungry. Some ran several times, although only Kaladin had the check. And, for the most part, these were the cheapest of the cheap, purchased at a deep discount. Most likely, they will be resold somewhere further away, where there is not enough labor. There are many independent small towns scattered on the outskirts of no man's hills, where no one has ever heard of Voron laws regarding slaves. The road was considered extremely dangerous. No one owned these lands, and by crossing them so far from the traditional caravan routes, Twillig risked running into a band of unemployed thugs, men without honor or conscience, quite capable of killing a slave owner and his slaves for the sake of a few chullas and wagons. People without honor. Are there people who have it? No, Kaladin thought. Honor died 8 months ago. Well, asked a slave with a tangled beard. Why were you made a slave? Kaladin grabbed the bars again. He did not answer the question, but spoke. Who is to blame for your capture? A woman, of course. I should have foreseen that she would sell me, said the long-bearded man. You better not steal the chul. They're too slow. Horses are much faster. The man laughed loudly. Horses? You think I'm crazy, right? If I had stolen horses, I would have been hanged. For the chul I only earned a mark on my forehead. Kaladin glanced at him sideways. Judging by his forehead, his interlocutor had been in captivity longer than Kaladin. The skin around the scar was discolored and white. What Glyphpara? Sars Moron, Kaladin said. The name of the overlord area where the person was branded. The slave looked at him in disbelief. Hey, do you know the glyphs? Some of the slaves nearby stirred, also shocked. Friend, your story is probably even stranger than I thought. Kaladin turned his gaze to the grasses that swayed in the gentle wind. Where the wind blew stronger, the most sensitive of the blades of grass disappeared into the shelters, forming bald spots, like on the skin of a sick horse. The windspren did not fly away, but still circled over the green sea of grass. How long does it follow him? At least a couple of months. Incredibly strange. Perhaps it's not the same one. It is impossible to distinguish them. Well. The slave tried to push him. Why are you here? So many reasons, Kaladin said. Failures. Crimes. Betrayal. Probably the same ones as all of us. Several people around him grumbled in agreement. In one of them the grumbling turned into a frequent cough. A constant cough, some part of Kaladin's mind thought, accompanied by delirium and phlegm. It sounds like grinding. Then said the talkative man, I'll ask another question. Be more specific, my mother told me. Say what you mean and ask what you want to know. Why did you receive the first mark on your forehead? Kaladin sat up, feeling the van rattle and roll beneath him. Killed the light-eyed one. His nameless interlocutor whistled, this time more respectfully than before. It's surprising that you weren't torn to pieces on the spot. I was not made a slave because of the light eye I killed, Kaladin said. Because of another, whom I did not kill. How so? Kaladin shook his head, not wanting to answer the overly curious slave's questions. He finally gave up and went to the front of the van and sat there, staring at his bare feet. Several hours passed and Kaladin still sat in place, aimlessly fingering the glyphs on his forehead. Now this is his life, day after day, riding in this damned cage. The first burns had healed a long time ago, but the skin around the sash was still red, irritated and covered with scabs. And it pulsed like a second heart. It burned much stronger than when he grabbed the hot handle of a frying pan as a child. Kaladin's head was drilled by his father's whisper, repeating a long-rehearsed lesson. Apply ointment to prevent infection. Rinse every day. Sad memories. It has neither four-leaf sap nor lister oil. And even water to wash the burn. The edges of the wound, covered with scabs, tightened the skin, and the forehead was pressed. He couldn't help himself and scratched his forehead every few minutes, tearing the wound until it bled. He was accustomed to wiping away the trickles of blood running from cracks in the crust. His right forearm was smeared with blood. If he had a mirror, he would likely see tiny red featherspren huddled around the wound. The sun set in the west, but the van continued to roll. Violet Salus rose above the eastern horizon, tentatively at first, as if he wanted to make sure the sun had disappeared. It was a clear night, the stars were trembling high in the sky. During this part of the year, Thal's scar, a flickering streak of dark red stars beneath flickering white ones, was high. The slave coughed again. Bad wet cough. Kaladin wanted to jump up and rush to the rescue, but something inside him changed. Too many of the people he tried to help are dead. He now believed rather illogically that without his intervention the person would only be better off. After the loss of Tien, then Dalit and his men, and the execution of 10 groups of slaves, one after another, it is difficult to find the desire to help. 2 hours after the first moon rose, Tulik finally called a halt. 2 rough mercenaries climbed down from their places on top of the wagons and began to build a fire. Lanky Terran, the servant boy, busied himself with the chullas. The large crustaceans were no smaller than the van itself. They settled down and pulled themselves inside the shells with the usual portion of grain in their claws. Soon they turned into 3 black hills, in the darkness no different from large boulders. It was the turn of the slaves. Tulik gave everyone a ladle of water. His property should be healthy, or at least as healthy as possible under such terrible conditions. Volume 1 Chapter 6. Twilik started with the first wagon, and Kaladin, still sitting at the bars, ran his fingers over the makeshift belt in which he had hidden the leaves. They crackled soothingly, the hard, dry husk pressed against the skin. He still didn't know what he was going to do with them. He had gathered them together like this, aimlessly, during one of their walks, when they were allowed to get out of the van and stretch their legs. He doubted that anyone else in the caravan would recognize them as blackbane narrow leaves on jagged trefoils, but he didn't want to risk it. He absent-mindedly took out the leaves and rubbed them between his index finger and thumb. They need to be dried, only then can their full power be used. But why does he keep them at all? Using them to take revenge on Tvilakwa? Or for an emergency when things get so bad that life becomes unbearable? Of course I'm not going to stoop that low, he thought. Most likely instinct. I saw a weapon, I had to take possession of it, even such an unusual one. It was dark all around. Salus is the smallest and faintest of all the moons, and its violet light, which has inspired countless poets, won't do much to help you see the hand in front of your own face. Dash about. Dash, said a soft female voice. Dash, what else is this? A translucent figure hands height floated over the edge of the floor next to Kaladin. She climbed into the van as if she were climbing a high mountain plateau. The windspread took the form of a tiny woman. Larger Spren could change shape and size with an angular face and long flowing hair that disappeared into the mist behind her head. She, Kaladin, had come to think of the Spren as a woman, was shimmering with pale blue and white colors, and wore a simple white dress, girlish in cut, that went down to mid-calf. Like his hair, its ends melted into the fog. Her legs, arms and face stood out clearly, and she also had the hips and breasts of a graceful, slender girl. Kaladin frowned at the spirit. The Spren were always around, and for the most part no one paid them any attention. But this one was strange. Now she moved as if she was stepping on an invisible staircase. Finally she rose high enough to see Kaladin's hand, so he covered the black leaves with his fingers. She walked around his fist. The spirit girl glowed faintly, like an image left on the retina after sunlight, but it did not illuminate anything. She bent down, looked at his hand from one angle, then another, like a child waiting to find hidden candy. Dash, what is this? Dash, she asked in a whisper. Dash, you can show me. I will not tell anyone. Is this a treasure? Did you cut off a piece of your lover's nightgown and hide it there? Or the heart of the beetle, tiny but mighty? He didn't answer, causing her to pout. Wingless, she flew up and froze in the air, looking him straight in the eyes. Kaladin, why don't you notice me? Kaladin winced. Dash, what did you say? The spirit girl smiled mischievously, jumped away, her figure blurred, turning into a long ribbon of blue-white light. She darted towards the bars, slipped through them, twisting and spinning in the air, like a piece of matter caught in the air, and disappeared. Dash, storm take you, Kaladin shouted, jumping to his feet. Dash, spirit. What did you say? Repeat. The Spren were unable to call him by name because they lacked intelligence. The larger ones, like Wind Spren or River Spren, imitated voices or copied facial expressions, but could not think. Could not. Dash, hey, did any of you hear? Kaladin asked, turning to his fellow inmates. The roof of the wagon was high enough for Kaladin to stand at full height. Everyone else lay waiting for their bucket of water. No one said anything, only a few muttered something, and the sick man in the corner began to cough. Not even Kaladin's friend paid him any attention. He generally fell into a daze, staring continuously at the soles of his feet, moving his toes from time to time. Maybe no one ever saw the Spren. Many of the larger Spren were invisible to everyone except the one being tormented. Kaladin sat back down on the floor and dangled his legs outward. The spirit girl called him by name, but no doubt she was only repeating what she had heard before. But none of the people in the cage knew his name. Am I going crazy? Kaladin thought. I see something that is not there. I hear voices. He took a deep breath and unclenched his fingers. He clenched his fist too tightly and broke some leaves. We need to wrap them up so that no more. Very interesting leaves, the same female voice was heard. Dash, you love them very much, huh? Kaladin jumped and turned toward the voice. The Spren stood in the air next to his head, her white robe fluttering in a wind Kaladin couldn't feel. Dash, how do you know my name? Dash, he asked. The Spren girl didn't answer. She leisurely walked through the air, stuck her head through the bars and watched for a while as Tflik distributed water to the last slaves in the first wagon. Then she looked back at Kaladin. Dash, why don't you fight? You used to struggle. It has stopped now. Dash, why do you care, spirit? She threw her head back. I don't know, she said, as if surprised at herself. Dash, but it worries me. This is weird. More than strange. This Spren not only said his name, but also remembered what he did a few weeks ago. How? People don't eat leaves, you know that, Kaladin, she said, folding her translucent hands. Then she threw her head back again. Dash, or do they eat? I don't remember. You are so strange. Your mouth is full of such strange words, and they come out when you think no one is watching. Dash, how do you know my name? Dash, he whispered. Dash, how do you know him? I know because it's mine. My parents told me this. Don't know. Me too, she nodded, as if she had won the argument. Great, he said. Dash, why are you using my name? Dash, because it's polite. And you are very impolite. Spren don't know what politeness is. Here we go again, she said, pointing at him. Dash, how impolite. Kaladin blinked. Well, after all, he was very far from where he grew up. He walks on strange stones and eats strange food. Perhaps there are other Spren living here, not like those at home. Dash, why didn't you give up the fight? She asked, landing on his feet and looking him straight in the eyes. As far as he could feel, she weighed nothing. I can't fight, he said quietly. Dash, you've done this before. He closed his eyes and pressed his head against the bars. Dash, I'm so tired. He didn't mean physical fatigue, although 8 months of living from hand to mouth had taken away a lot of the strength he had developed during the war. He felt tired, even when I got enough sleep. Even on those rare days when he was not hungry and not stiff from beatings. Dash, you used to be tired too. I have failed, Spirit, he answered, closing his eyes tighter. Dash, why are you torturing me? They all died. Ken and Dalit, and before them Tux and Tucker. Even earlier Tien. And even earlier he remembered the blood on his hands and the corpse of a young girl with pale skin. Some of the slaves near him began to whisper, probably thinking that he had gone crazy. Anyone can try to talk to a Spren, but everyone quickly learns that it is pointless. Has he gone crazy? Perhaps this is what he should want, to be free from pain. But for now she torments him. He opened his eyes. Tulik had already approached their van with a bucket of water. The plump, brown-eyed man limped slightly, probably having broken his leg at some point. He was from Thalen, and all Talenians have the same white beards regardless of age or hair color and white eyebrows. These eyebrows grow to incredible sizes, and the Talons push them back behind their ears, 2 white strands among black hair. His clothes, pants with black and red stripes, a dark blue sweater, and a knit cap of the same color had once been beautiful, but were now torn and frayed. How is he different from a slave? His life, the daily selling and buying of human flesh, seems to have affected him greatly. He was tormented in soul, although he filled his pockets full of money. Volume 1, Chapter 7. Twilig, keeping his distance from Kaladin, held the oil lamp to the grate, examining the coughing slave, then called out to the mercenaries. One of them, Bluth Kaladin didn't even know why he had learned their names, stepped forward, and Twilig said something quietly to him, pointing at the slave. Bluth nodded, a shadow came over his rough face, and he took the club from his belt. The air spren smoothly flowed into a white ribbon and rushed to the patient. She flew around him several times and only then dropped to the floor, becoming a girl again. She seemed to be studying the man. Like a curious child. Kaladin turned away and closed his eyes. And again my father's clear voice sounded in my head. To cure a grinding cough, take 2 handfuls of blood ivy, grind it and prepare a drink. Take every day. If ivy is not available, give the patient a strengthening drink, preferably with sugar. If the patient drinks enough, he is likely to survive. Most likely he will survive. The cough did not subside. Someone unlocked the cage door. Do they know how to help a person? Quite simple. Give him water and he will survive. Doesn't matter. It's better not to interfere. People die on the battlefield. A young face, so familiar and dear, looks at Kaladin for salvation. The sword cuts the neck. The bearer of the shards cut into Amram's army. Blood. Death. Defeat. Pain. Father's voice. Do you really want to leave him, son? Let him die even though you can help. Take the storm. Dash, stop. Kaladin shouted, standing up. The rest of the slaves shied away. Bluth slammed the cage door and raised his baton. Twilig hid behind the mercenary, using him as cover. Kaladin took a deep breath, clutched the leaves tightly with one hand, and brushed away the blood with the other. Then he crossed the small cell, bare feet stomping loudly on the wooden floor, and knelt beside the patient. The flickering light illuminated the elongated, exhausted face and bloodless lips. The patient coughed again, sputum is greenish and thick. Kaladin felt the man's neck for swelling and checked his dark brown eyes. It's called a rasping cough, Kaladin said. He will live if you give him an extra ladle of water every 2 hours for 5 days. You have to force him to drink. Mix with sugar if you have it. Bluth scratched his massive chin and looked questioningly at the short slave owner. Get him out, Twilig said. The sick slave woke up when Bluth opened the cage. The mercenary waved his club casually, and Kaladin reluctantly retreated. Putting his baton away, Bluth grabbed the man under the arms and dragged him outside, all the while glancing nervously at Kaladin. Kaladin's last failed escape involved 20 armed slaves. The owner should have killed him, but he only called him an intriguer, branded him with a sword, and sold him for a pittance. There was always a reason Kaladin survived even though those he tried to help died. Some people might call it a blessing, but he might call it irony mixed with torture. With the previous owner, he spent some time communicating with a man from the west, a Shallan, who told him legends about the old magic, capable of bewitching people. Perhaps this is exactly what is happening to him. Don't be stupid, he told himself. The cage door clicked shut. The cages were a necessity. Twilig had to protect his fragile possessions from superstorms. The cages had wooden walls, which were put up as soon as a hurricane began. Bluth dragged the slave behind the fire and placed him next to an unopened keg of water. Kaladin relaxed. Perhaps you can still help, he told himself. Perhaps there is something to live for. Kaladin unclenched his fist and looked at the black leaves in his palm. He doesn't need them. Put them in Twilakwa's drink. Dangerous and useless. Does he really want to kill the slave owner? What will he achieve with this? There was a dull crack in the air, followed by another, as if someone had dropped a sack of grain. Kaladin lifted his head and looked at where Bluth had placed the sick slave. The mercenary again raised the club, then sharply lowered it down. The weapon crushed the slave's skull. The slave did not make a sound, did not cry out in pain or indignation. His body lay motionless in the darkness. Bluth picked up a corpse and threw it over his shoulder. No! Kaladin shouted, jumping towards the bars and slamming his hands on the bars. No! Twilig backed away from the fire, looking at Kaladin warily. Storm take you! Kaladin yelled. He could have survived, you bastard! Twilig looked at him. Then he slowly adjusted his embroidered blue cap. He could infect you all, you know, he said, pronouncing the words with a slight accent, with incorrect accents and splicing words together. It always seemed to Kaladin that the Tylans did not speak, but mumbled. I don't want to lose the whole van because of one person. It's no longer contagious, Kaladin said, slapping his palms against the bars. If any of us had caught a disease from him, we would all have been coughing for a long time. Now you definitely won't. And he was hopeless. I told you the opposite. Why should I believe you, deserter? Twilig said, perking up. Why should I trust a person whose eyes burn with hatred? You would kill me if you could. He shrugged. But I do not care. I want you to be healthy when the time comes to sell you. Yes, you should thank me for saving you from illness. I will bless your burial pyramid when I place your corpse upon it, Kaladin growled. Twilig grinned, but moved closer to the fire. Better save your strength and rage, deserter. They should pay me well for them. Only if you live, Kaladin thought. Twilig, after giving the slaves a drink, always boiled the remaining water in the bucket and made tea from it. If Kaladin manages to get the water last, it would be a simple matter to throw some leaf powder into the water and... Kaladin froze and looked at his hands. In his haste, he completely forgot about the blackbane and dropped the leaves as he slammed his hands on the bars. There are a few pieces left, too few. He turned and looked back. The floor of the cage was covered in dirt. If leaves fall on it, that's it, it's impossible to collect them. And then the wind rose, blowing dirt and dust into the night. And even here he lost. He sat down with his back to the bars and bowed his head. Defeat. The cursed airspren darted around him, looking confused. City of Bells. A man stood on a cliff and looked at his native country, which had fallen to dust. Far below rushed a stormy stream. He heard the child scream. These were his own tears. Received on the 4th day of Tanit 1171, 30 seconds before death. The subject is a fairly well-known shoemaker. Shallan never imagined that she would one day end up in Carbanth, the city of bells. She often dreamed of traveling, but was sure that she would have to spend her entire youth on the family estate, traveling only with the heroes of books from her father's library. Then she will be married off to one of her father's allies, and she will exchange one estate for another. Waiting is a bit like a fragile vase. The tighter you hold on to it, the easier it cracks. And so she stands, holding her breath and clutching a sketchbook to her chest, while the port workers pull the ship towards the pier. The huge city was amazing. Built on a steep slope, Carbanth appeared to be driven into a wide rift like a wedge, the wide side facing the ocean. Heavy buildings with square windows, built, judging by the appearance, from some kind of clay. Cram. The facades are brightly colored, most often red or orange, although blue and yellow are also found. And bells, of course. She had already heard their clear voices. She had to crane her neck to see the highest point of the city. Carbanth, like a mountain, loomed above her. How many inhabitants does it have? Thousands? Tens of thousands? She shivered again, dismayed but inspired, then closed her eyes, committing what she had seen to memory. Volume 1 Chapter 8. Sailors were bustling around. The Wind's Pleasure, a narrow craft with one sail, could hardly accommodate her, the captain, his wife and half a dozen sailors. From the very beginning it seemed too fragile to her, but Captain Tosbeck, a calm, careful man, turned out to be an excellent sailor, although a pagan. He carefully navigated the ship along the coast, always managing to find shelter from superstorms. The captain carefully monitored the progress of the mooring. Tosbek, a short man, as tall as Shallan, combed his white Thalian eyebrows in a very funny way, and they looked like two fans swaying above his eyes, each a foot long. He wore a simple embroidered cap and a black doublet with silver buttons. She used to imagine that he received the scar on his jaw in a hot battle with pirates. But yesterday I was disappointed to hear that during bad weather he was hit on the head by a loose tackle. His wife, Eshelv, was already coming down the ramp to notify the authorities of their arrival. The captain, noticing that Shallan was looking at him, approached the girl. He was an old business partner of their family, his father trusted him completely. And that was good, because according to the plan she had come up with the help of her brothers, she could not take a maid of honor or a nanny with her. It was this plan that made Shallan nervous. Flutter like an aspen leaf in the wind. She hated lying. But the financial situation of their family, they were in dire need of cash injections or some other support from Vida's politicians. Otherwise, they won't last even a year. First things first, Shallan thought, forcing herself to calm down. Find Jasna Collin. Assuming she didn't leave without me again. I sent a guy to make inquiries about the princess on your behalf, Your Grace, Tosbek said. If she's here, we'll know soon enough. Shallan nodded gratefully, still clutching the sketchbook. Hundreds of people were scurrying along the shore. Some wore familiar clothes, trousers, shirts laced to the chest, women sported skirts and colored blouses. Some of them could be from her home country, Jarquived. Carbrant was an independent city-state, albeit small and weak, and its piers were open to all ships. No one asked about nationality or position. And people flowed into it. A sea of people the likes of which she had never seen. But these, wrapped in one piece of cloth, are most likely men or women from Tashik, in the far west. But these ones in long frock coats that reached to the ankles, but were open at the chest, like cloaks, where did they come from? It's not often you see so many Parshmen working on the piers, carrying loads on their backs. Like the Parshmen her father had owned, they were strong people with thick arms and legs and strange skin that seemed to be made of marble, some pieces white or black, others red. The pattern was never repeated from person to person. For the better part of those 6 months, Shallan had been hunting for Jasna Collin, moving from city to city, and she had begun to think that she would never find her. Is the princess avoiding her? No, it can't be. Shallan is not that important a person. And her ladyship Jasna Collin is one of the most powerful women in the world. And one of the most dishonest. The only heretic among the members of the venerable royal family. Shallan tried to calm herself. Most likely, they will find out that Jasna has slipped away again. The Wind's Pleasure would remain docked overnight, and she would again have to negotiate a price with the captain, hopefully at a discount, because her family had invested enough money in Tosbek's business of sailing to the next port. Months have passed since Tosbek expected to get rid of her, but she never felt his dissatisfaction, honor and loyalty forced him to always agree with her demands. However, his patience and her money will have to run out someday. She had already used half of the orbs she took with her. Of course, he will not leave her alone in an unfamiliar city, but alas, he may insist that they return to Vedana. Captain, the sailor shouted, running up the ladder. His dark skin, a man constantly working in the sun, was covered only by a loose trousers and a vest. Sir, the port official says she hasn't left yet. Ha, the captain said, turning to Shallan. The hunt is over. Praise be to the heralds, she whispered. The captain smiled, his bushy eyebrows seeming like streams of light flowing from his eyes. Perhaps your beautiful face brought us a fair wind. Even the airspread admire you, your grace, and brought us here. Shallan blushed, deciding it was best not to answer. Yeah. Said the captain and pointed his finger at her. I see you have something to say. I see it in your eyes, young lady. Spit out the words. They cannot be kept inside, they are free creatures, and if they are not given free rein, the stomach will be upset. It wouldn't be polite, Shallan protested. Tosbek laughed. Months of travel, but you have not changed. Once again I tell you, we are sailors. We forgot what politeness was the moment we first stepped on deck, and we cannot be changed. She smiled. Stern nannies and teachers taught her to keep her mouth shut, although her brothers reveled in the moments when she spoke. She liked to amuse them with cutting remarks, but only when no one else could hear. She thought fondly of the hours spent next to the crackling fire in her room, the youngest 3 of her 4 brothers sitting around, listening to her mock her father's latest hanger-on or the next wandering ardent. She often came up with stupid monologues that were supposedly spoken by famous people. The latter, if they found out that they said something similar, would be very surprised. What the nannies called impudence was ingrained in her, and the sailors appreciated her witty remarks even more than her brothers. Okay, Shallan said, embarrassed but ready to speak. That's what I thought. You said that my beauty appeased the winds, and that's why they brought us to Carbrant so quickly. Therefore, we were late all the time just because I lack beauty, right? So, in fact, you told me that I was beautiful exactly a 6th of the way. Nonsense. Young lady, you are as beautiful as the dawn of the sun. Sunrise that is, to Pink. She tugged at her long auburn hair, and I make men grumble when they see me. He laughed, and several sailors joined him. Okay, said Captain Tosbek, you are like a flower. I'm allergic to flowers, she grimaced. He raised an eyebrow. But she admitted, they are really charming. But if you slip me a bouquet, I will start sneezing with such force that you will have to look for flying freckles on the walls. Even if this is true, I will still repeat that you are as beautiful as a flower. Then, as I understand it, young people my age are allergic to flowers, and that's probably why they stay away from me. She winced. You see, I told you it was impolite. A young woman should hold her tongue behind her teeth. Ah, young lady, said the captain, and the tip of his embroidered cap swung towards her. The guys and I will miss your sharp tongue. I don't even know what we will do without you. You will most likely swim, she answered. And you will eat, drink, sing and look at the waves. Everything you do now, only you will have more time. You won't have to trip over a girl sitting on the deck with a sketchbook in her hands, sketching and muttering something. But I thank you, Captain, for the journey. It was simply amazing, although a little long. He tilted his cap towards her in understanding. Shallan grinned. She herself had not expected to feel so relaxed. The brothers were worried that she was too timid. They considered her timid because she did not like to argue and usually remained silent in the presence of many people. Perhaps she really should be shy, having gone so far from Jarkivd. But it's so amazing. She had already filled 3 albums with drawings of animals and people, and although worries about the family's finances constantly clouded her thoughts, she enjoyed new events and experiences. Volume 1 Chapter 9. Tosbek took up ship affairs. He is a good man, and she certainly understood that he admired her inner beauty, hidden from view. Although, of course, he was exaggerating. She had white skin, but now everyone is crazy about the tanned skin of the Alethi. Her eyes, yes, were indeed light blue, but her not so pure family pedigree gave her dark red hair. Not a single black curl. Glory to the heralds, when she reached womanhood, almost all of her freckles had disappeared, but the splashes of the sun still dotted her cheeks and nose. The young lady, said the captain, giving orders to the sailors. Her Grace Jasna, she is certainly in the conclave. Oh, is that where Palladium is? Yes, sure. And the king himself lives there. This is the city center, one might say. Only at the very top. He scratched his chin. In any case, Her Grace Jasna is the king's sister. She will not stop anywhere else in Carbranth. Yalb will show you the way. We will send your chests later. Thank you very much, Captain. The girl thanked and added the traditional wish of happiness in Talon. Shayla, Mkbatner. May the winds favor you. The captain smiled widely. Mkai bade Fortentis. She had no idea what that meant. She could read Talon well, but she couldn't comprehend almost anything by air. She smiled, which turned out to be an appropriate response, because he smiled too, and waved to one of his sailors. We'll be at the pier for 2 more days, he said. You see, tomorrow there will be a superstorm, so there is no way we can sail earlier. If your affairs with Her Ladyship Jasna do not go as you hope, we can take you back to Jarkivd. And thank you again. You're welcome, young lady, he said. In any case, we had to stay late to buy goods. In addition, in gratitude for my cabin, you painted a wonderful portrait of my wife. Really, it's nice. He approached Yalb, giving him instructions. Shallan waited, tucking the album into her leather bag. Yalb. It's hard to even pronounce it in Vedic. Why are the Thalan so fond of stringing together consonants without vowels? Yalb waved his hand at her. She followed him. Be careful, girl, the captain warned as she passed by. Even a safe city like Carbranth hides many dangers. Keep your ears on top of your head. I prefer to keep my ears under my hair, Captain, she answered, carefully stepping along the gangway. If I keep them on top of my head, then someone will definitely try to return them to their place with a baton. The captain laughed, waved goodbye, and she headed down the ladder, holding onto the railing with her right free hand. Like all Vorin women, she kept her left safe hand closed, exposing only her free one. Ordinary dark-eyed women wore the glove, but a woman of her rank should show more modesty. Her safe arm was covered by the long cuff of her left sleeve, buttoned all the way up. The traditional Vorin dress fit tightly around the chest, shoulders and waist, and ended in a full skirt. It was made of blue silk with chola shell buttons on both sides. She clutched her bag to her chest with her safe hand and held onto the railing with her free hand. She stepped off the ramp and plunged into the feverish bustle that reigned on the pier. Messengers rushed back and forth. Women in red clothes wrote down information about goods in ledgers. Carbranth was the kingdom of Vorin, like Alethkar the homeland of Shallan, Jarkivd. They were not pagans at all, and the ability to write was part of traditional female training. The men knew only the glyphs, leaving the letters and reading to their sisters and wives. She didn't ask, but she had no doubt that Captain Tosbek could read. She saw him holding books and felt uncomfortable. It was rare that a man could read. At least those who were not ardent. Do you want to go for a ride? Yalb asked in such a terrible Thaylen accent that Shallan had trouble understanding him. I think, yes. He nodded and rushed off, leaving her on the dock, surrounded by a group of parshmen who were busily moving wooden boxes from one pile to another. Parshmen were not distinguished by their sharp minds, but they made excellent workers. They never complained and diligently did what they were told. Her father preferred them to ordinary slaves. Are the parshmen actually fighting the Alethi on the shattered plains? It seemed so strange to Shallan. Parshmen are not warriors. They are obedient and practically harmless. Yes, of course, she had heard that Parshendi were fighting on the shattered plains, physically different in some way from ordinary Parshmen. Stronger, taller, smarter. Perhaps not Parshmen at all, but their distant relatives. To her surprise, she also saw animals on the piers. Several sky eels fluttered through the air, searching for rats or fish. Tiny crabs hid in the cracks of the decking, and schools of harspers hung on thick logs. On the street leading into the city, they hid in the shade of their holes, waiting for the fallen pieces. She couldn't resist herself, opened the bag and began to sketch the hunting sky eel. Should she be afraid of all these people? She held the sketchbook in a safe hand, clutching it tightly with the fingers hidden under her cuff, and drew with a charcoal pencil. Before she had time to finish, her guide returned with a man harnessed to a strange carriage, 2 large wheels and a seat covered with a canopy. Shallan hesitantly lowered the album. She was waiting for the palanquin. The man pushing the cart was short and dark-skinned, with a wide smile and full lips. He motioned for Shallan to sit down, which she did, gracefully enough, as her nannies had taught her. The driver asked something in a sharp, abrupt language that she did not recognize. What did he say? She asked Yalb. He wants to know whether to take you the short way or the long way. Yalb scratched his head. I don't see the difference. I suspect the longer one is more expensive, Shallan replied. Oh, you are very smart. Yalb said something to the porter in the same harsh language. The man said something in response. On a long journey you can explore the city, Yalb translated. Short straight to the conclave. Few good views, he said. It looks like he noticed that it was your first time in the city. Do I really stand out that much? Shallan blushed. No, of course not, your grace. So you're saying that I'm like a wart on the queen's nose? Yalb laughed. Well, yes. But you can't go somewhere a second time if you haven't been the first time. Anyone sometimes stands out, especially a pretty girl like you. She was already accustomed to the polite courtship of the sailors. They never went too far. She suspected that the captain's wife had spoken sternly to them when she noticed that even timid flirtation made Shallan blush. On my father's estate, servants, even full-fledged citizens, were afraid to say an extra word. The driver was still waiting for an answer. Shortcut, please, she told Yalb, although she wished she had taken the more scenic route. She is finally in a real city and must take a shortcut. But her ladyship Jasna is as elusive as a wild songling, and it is better to hurry. The main road cut through a steep slope, constantly rolling over small hills, and even on a short route, there was enough time for her to see most of the city. Carbranth turned out to be breathtakingly rich in strange people, sights and ringing bells. Shallan leaned back in her seat and absorbed it. Shops of the same color stood side by side, and the color seemed to represent what they sold. Purple for clothes, green for food. There was also a pattern to the colors of the houses, but Shallan couldn't figure it out. The colors were soft, washed out and muted. Yalb walked next to the cart. The driver said something to him. Yalb translated with his hands in his vest pockets. He says that it's light here and that's why the city is so unusual. Volume 1 Chapter 10. Shallan nodded. Many cities were built in Leith, an area protected by rocks from the superstorm. Carbranth is one of the safest cities in the world, Yalb continued to translate, and the bells symbolize this. According to him, they were first installed to warn of the approach of a superstorm. They say the wind was so weak that people did not pay attention to it. Yalb hesitated. He's telling all this because he wants a big tip, your grace. I've heard this story before and I think it's complete nonsense. If the wind blows so hard that the bells ring, then people will notice. Besides, how can you miss anything when the damn rain is pattering on the top of your head? Shallan smiled. Nothing, let him continue. The driver continued in his chopped language. Which one, I wonder? Shallan listened to Yalb's translation, taking in the sights, sounds, and sadly smells. Since childhood, she had become accustomed to the pleasant smells of freshly cleaned furniture and freshly baked bread preparing in the kitchen. Traveling across the ocean introduced her to the salty and clean sea air. There was no hint of cleanliness here. Each alley had its own disgusting stench. She was replaced by the pungent aromas of food sold by street vendors. The proximity made her sick. Fortunately, the driver pulled the cart along the very center of the wide street, where the stench was less noticeable, although due to the heavy traffic they did not move very quickly. She looked with all her eyes at those who walked or drove past. The men with bluish skin and gloves were, of course, from Nathan. But where do these tall, stately people in black clothes come from? What about people with beards braided into icicle-shaped braids? The sounds that poured into Shallan's ears rivaled the chorus of wild songlings outside her home, only more varied and louder. Hundreds of voices shouted at each other, mixed with the slamming of doors, the sound of wheels on stone, and the screams of sky eels. The never-ending ringing of bells formed the background, intensifying when the wind blew. There were bells in the windows, hanging in the rafters, on every lamp post, and even on each of the four corners of her cart canopy. She drove halfway when the chimes struck the hour. Immediately a loud, discordant ringing of small bells arose. The crowd thinned as they reached the upper quarters of the city, and finally the driver stopped the cart in front of a massive building at the very top of the city. The building was painted white and seemed more carved from the rock of the mountain than built from bricks or baked clay. The front columns rose out of the stone, and the back side merged with the cliff. The structure was topped by several squat domes painted in metallic colors. Light-eyed women came in and out, holding writing utensils. They were dressed like Shallan herself, with a cuff covering the left palm. The men wore pants made of stiff material and long buttoned Vorin uniforms, ending with a stiff collar that surrounded the entire neck. Many of them had a sword hanging from their belt. The driver said something to Yalb. The sailor, arms akimbo, began to argue with him. Shallan smiled at his serious expression and squinted her eyes as she memorized the scene. She will draw it later. He's offering to split the difference with me if I let him increase the price of the ride, Yalb said indignantly, shaking his head and offering Shallan his hand, helping her off the carriage. She went downstairs and looked at the driver, who was embarrassed and smiled stupidly, like a child caught stealing candy. She clutched the bag with her safe hand, and with her free hand, searched for the pouch of money. How much do I really owe him? 2 fragments are more than enough. I'd give 1. And this thief wants 5. Before this trip, she had never used money, she only admired its beauty. Each sphere consisted of a glass bead, slightly larger than a fingernail, and a small gemstone in the middle. The stone could collect stormlight, causing the orb to glow. She opened the bag, from which fragments of rubies, emeralds, diamonds and sapphires shone. She chose the 3 diamonds that cost the least. The most expensive were emeralds. With their help the transformers created food. The glass part of the sphere was always the same size. The value was determined by the stone inside. These 3 pieces, for example, contained tiny pieces of diamond, large enough to make the spheres glow with stormlight, but too weak for a lamp. The mark, a sphere of average value, glowed weaker than a candle, and it took 5 fragments to form a mark. She only brought stormlight-charged orbs with her, as she had heard that dark ones were considered suspicious. Sometimes the moneylender was even dragged to court if they doubted the authenticity of the stone. She kept the most valuable spheres in a secret pouch hidden in her left sleeve. She handed the 3 spheres to Yalb, who raised his head. She nodded at the driver and blushed, realizing that she had unwittingly used Yalb as a servant. Was he offended? He laughed, straightened up, as if imitating a majordomo, and with a grim grin paid the driver. He laughed, bowed to Shallan, and pulled his cart away. "This is for you," Shallan said, taking out a ruby worth a mark and giving it to Yalb. "Your Grace, this is too much." "Partly out of gratitude," she replied, "but mostly so you could stay here for a few hours in case I came back." Firebrand in a few hours. "Yes, this is a sailor's weekly salary." "Then this is enough to make you not want to go anywhere." "I won't leave my place," Yalb said, bowing surprisingly deftly. Shallan took a deep breath and walked towards the majestic entrance to the conclave. The castle carved from stone was magnificent. The artist begged her to linger and study it, but she remained adamant and entered the huge building as if it had swallowed her. Stormlight lamps hung from the walls of the corridor, shining with a bright white light. Most likely, inside each of them there was a diamond broom. Most beautiful buildings used stormlight for lighting. Broom, the sphere of maximum value, shone like several candles. In the steady light of the lamps, an endless stream of light eyes, their servants and scribes moved along the corridor. The building appeared to be a long, wide tunnel carved out of stone. On its sides there were large rooms and side corridors. She felt more confident here than outside. This place with its hurrying servants, low lords and bright ladies was familiar to her. She raised her free hand, a sign that she needed help, and predictably, a majordomo in a crisp white shirt and black trousers immediately appeared in front of her. "Your Mightiness," he asked in her native Vedan, probably guessing the language by the color of her hair. "I am looking for Jasna Colin," Shallan said. "They told me that she is within these walls." The majordomo bowed elegantly. Most of the palace servants boasted excellent posture, the same one that Yalb had just tried to ridicule. "I will return immediately with an answer, Your Grace." He was a dark-eyed citizen of the second Nan, a very high rank. In Vorin's faith, choosing a vocation, a task to which a person devoted his entire life, was considered vital. Choosing a good profession and working tirelessly is the best way to guarantee yourself a good place in afterlife. Most often, those who chose a vocation based on their nature united into special devotees. Shallan crossed her arms and waited. She had been thinking about her own calling for a long time. Obviously it's art she liked to draw. But something attracted her more than drawing: the study, the questions that arose during observation. Why are sky eels afraid of people? What do hospers eat? Why do rats succeed in one area and disappear in another? So she chose natural history. Volume 1, Chapter 11. She wanted to become a real scientist, receive difficult tasks, and engage in deep research. Is this why she developed a daring plan to find Jasna and become her ward? Maybe. However, she will need to remain constantly vigilant. Becoming Jasna's mentee and student is only the first step. She thought about this as she absent-mindedly walked up to the column and stroked the polished stone with a free hand. Like almost all the cities of Russia except for some areas on the coast, Karbon was built from rough natural stone. The buildings stood directly on the stone, and this was carved into it. A granite column, she decided, although she could not boast of deep knowledge of geology. The floor was covered with a long, fiery orange carpet. The thick material was supposed to look rich, but was worn out from constant walking on it. The wide rectangular corridor gave the impression of being very old. She once read that Karbon was supposedly founded back in the dark times, before the last desolation. Then, of course, he was very old. Thousands of years, the horrors of the theocracy, and all long before the treason. At a time when the bringers of the void walked the earth with bodies made of stone. Your mightiness. She heard behind her. Shallan turned to find the servant had returned. This way, your grace. She nodded, and the majordomo quickly led her along a busy corridor. She thought about how to introduce herself to Jasna. This woman has long become a legend. Even Shallan, who lives on a distant estate in Jarkivd, has heard of the extraordinary abilities of the Alethi king's sister. Jasna was only 34 years old, but it was said that she would have long ago received the cap of a master scientist if it had not been for the open disgrace of religion. More precisely, she vehemently criticized the Devatari, the various religious brotherhoods in which the Vorin believers united. Vulgar jokes wouldn't help her now. She must speak with decorum and decorum. The tutelage of a famous woman is the best way to master women's sciences. Music, drawing, reading, logic. In the same way, in order to find something to do for men, young men tried to join the honorary guard of some respected Brightlord. At first, out of desperation, Shallan wrote Jasna a letter about guardianship and never expected to receive a positive response. And when she received it, a requirement to arrive in Diamondari in 2 weeks, she was shocked. Since then, she has been hunting for the elusive woman. Jasna is a heretic. Will she demand that Shallan give up her faith? It is highly doubtful that Shallan will be able to do this. In those difficult days, when the worst happened to her father, the teachings of Vorin, with its glory and radiance, became one of the few refuges of her soul. They turned into a narrow corridor and began to wind around somewhere very far from the main tunnel. Finally, the majordomo stopped at the corner and motioned to Shallan that she was there. Voices came from the corridor to her right. Shallan hesitated. Sometimes she wondered how she had even got into this point. The timidest, quietest, youngest of all 5 children and the only girl. Taken care of and protected by everyone. And now the fate of the whole family depends only on her. Their father died, and it was vital that this remained a secret. She didn't like to remember that day. She forbade herself to think about it at all and taught herself to immediately focus on something else. But losing his father could have been catastrophic. My father took out many loans, some for deals, some for bribery, disguising the latter as the former. As a result, the House of Deva owed a lot of money to a large number of people, and without the influence of their father, creditors would very quickly pounce on them. There was no one to turn to for help. Her family, mainly because of her father, was hated even by her allies. Crown Prince Valam, the Brightlord to whom her family had sworn allegiance, was ill, and no one else offered them protection. When word gets out that her father is dead and their family is bankrupt, it will be the end of the Deva house. They will be swallowed and subjugated by another house. They worked until exhaustion, like the damned. Everything is in vain. Out of desperation, they were already thinking about killing the most annoying creditors. Only Shallan could stop this, and the first step was meeting Jasna Collin. Shallan took a deep breath and turned the corner. Shattered plains. I'm dying, huh? Hey, doctor, why did you pump the blood out of me? Who is that behind you, with a head of lines? I see the distant sun, dark and cold, shining in the black sky. Received on the 3rd day of Jesnan, 1172, 11 seconds before death. Object decide, Chol trainer. The example deserves special attention. Why aren't you crying? The airspren asked. Kaladin sat with his back against the corner, looking down. The floor slats in front of him were splintered, as if someone had tried to tear them off with their fingernails. There were dark stains on the splintered part where the dry grey wood was wetted with blood. A futile, delusional escape attempt. The van continued to roll. The same thing every day. In the morning they wake you up, everything hurts after a restless night spent on the floor, without a mattress or blanket. The entire wagon is awakened at the same time. The slaves, shackled, are taken outside, given the opportunity to stretch their legs and relieve themselves. Then they gather them together, give them the morning gruel, and the van rolls forward again, right up to the afternoon gruel. And forward again. Evening gruel, then a ladle of water before bed. Kaladin's sword still hurt and bled. Thankfully, at least the roof of the cage protected me from the sun. An Espren appeared in the fog like a small cloud. She floated closer to Kaladin, the movement as if her face had been blown out of the fog, revealing something more substantial to him. Vaporous, feminine and triangular. With very curious eyes, which he had not seen on any of the Spren. Everyone else cries at night, she said. Dash, but not you. Dash, why cry? Dash, he asked, resting his head against the bars. Dash, what will it change? Dash, don't know. Why do people cry? Kaladin smiled, closing his eyes. Ask All Might, little Spren. Not me. Because of the wet eastern summer, sweat streamed down my forehead, drops of which burned as they got into the wound. He hoped that soon, in a few weeks, spring would come. The weather and seasons are unpredictable, you never know how long they will last, although each season usually lasts a few weeks. The van rolled forward. After some time, he felt the sun on his face and opened his eyes. The sun's rays were shining through the top edge of the cage. 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. What about the day's gruel? Kaladin grabbed the steel bars with his hand and stood up. He couldn't tell if Twillick was driving the wagon in front, but flat-faced Bluth was definitely sitting on the box of the back wagon. He was wearing a dirty shirt laced at the front and a wide-brimmed sun hat. The spear and club lay on the bench next to him, but not the sword. Even Tvilakwa did not have a sword. The grass swayed not far from the road, disappeared in front of the wagons and appeared behind them. Here and there were strange bushes that Kaladin didn't recognize, thick trunks and branches, prickly green needles. As the wagons drew closer, the needles were attracted into the stems, leaving twisted worm-like trunks with gnarled branches. They dotted the rolling hills, rising from the grassy rocks like little sentinels. It was well past noon and the wagons continued to roll. Why wasn't there a stop for gruel? Finally the first van stopped. The other two, swaying, stopped behind him. The red-shelled shells were agitated, their antennae moving back and forth. The box-like animals carried their shells around. Their thick red legs looked more like logs. Kaladin had heard that their claws could easily bite through a human hand. But the Chollas were obedient, especially the tamed ones, and he had never seen a soldier give them anything more than a gentle pinch. Volume 1 Chapter 12. Bluth and Thug climbed down from their wagons and walked towards Tvilakwa. The slave owner was sitting on the van's radiator, shielding his face from the white sun with his hand and holding a sheet of paper in front of him. The trio began to argue heatedly about something. Tvilakwa kept waving his hand in the direction they were going, pointing at a piece of paper. Are you lost, Tvilakwa? Kaladin shouted. Then pray to the Almighty to guide you on the right path. I heard he has a soft spot for slave owners. He even set aside a special place for you in the abyss. One of the slaves to Kaladin's left, the long-bearded man who had spoken to him a few days ago, moved furtively to the side, not wanting to be near the one who was provoking the slave master. Tvilakwa hesitated, then waved sharply at the mercenaries, calming them down. The fat man jumped off the wagon and approached Kaladin. Listen, deserter, he said. Alethi armies cross these hills when they go to war. Do you know this area? Let me see the map, Kaladin said. Tvilakwa hesitated, but then handed it to Kaladin. Kaladin reached through the bars and grabbed the map. Then, without looking into it, he tore it in half. Then, looking into Tvilakwa's frightened eyes, he tore it into hundreds of pieces. Tvilakwa called to the mercenaries, but by the time they ran up to the wagon, Kaladin had already shredded the map pieces into confetti and tossed them into the air. Happy mid-year, bastards, Kaladin shouted as scraps of paper fluttered around the mercenaries. Then he turned away, walked to the back wall of the cage and sat down. Tvilakwa was stunned and speechless with surprise. Then, his face flushed, he pointed at Kaladin and hissed something at the mercenaries. Bluth started to step towards the cage, but suddenly stopped, shrugged his shoulders and walked away. Tvilakwa turned to Tag, but he only shook his head and said something quietly. After fuming at the cowardly mercenaries for several minutes, Tvilakwa walked around the cage and walked over to where Kaladin was sitting and spoke in a surprisingly calm voice. I see that you are a smart guy, deserter. You have made your life priceless. None of the other slaves had been here, and I myself had never walked this way. Let's make a deal. You will lead us. What do you want in exchange? I can promise you an extra portion of food every day if I'm happy with you. Do you want me to lead the caravan? I will take your instructions. Fine. But first, find a cliff. From which one will you look around the surroundings? From which I will throw you down. Twilik adjusted his cap irritably, touching one of his long eyebrows. You hate me. Great. Hate makes you strong and I'll get you good money. But you can't take revenge on me if I don't bring you to the market. I won't let you escape. And someone else, why not? You want to be sold, don't you? I have no intention of seeking revenge, Kaladin said. The Aspran returned a few minutes ago. She went to explore the strange bushes. She hovered in the air and began to walk around Twilek's face, examining it. It looks like the slave trader didn't see her. Twilik frowned. Aren't you going to take revenge? It won't work, Kaladin replied. I learned this lesson many years ago. Many years ago? You can't be older than 18, deserter. Good guess. He was 19. Was it really only 4 years ago that he joined Amram's army? But Kaladin felt as if he were dozens of years old. You are young, Twilik continued, and you can escape your fate. There are people who live peacefully, despite the marks of slavery. You can buy yourself out of slavery, right? Or convince one of the masters to release you. You will become a free man again. That happens. Kaladin snorted. I will never be free of these marks, Twilik. You should know that I tried 10 times and always failed to escape. It is not the glyphs on my head that make your mercenaries fear me. Past failures don't prove anything. You will still have an opportunity in the future, right? I've had enough. Freedom no longer appeals to me. He looked straight at the slave owner. Besides, you don't believe your own words. A man like you would hardly sleep well at night if he truly believed that one day the soul slaves would be freed and found him. Twilik laughed. Who knows, deserter? Maybe you are right. I'm sure that, once freed, you will hunt the one who sold you into slavery. Brightlord Amram, right? I will immediately disappear as soon as I find out about his death. How does he know? Where did he hear about Amram? I will find him, Kaladin thought. I will gut him with my own hands. I'll rip his head off. Yes, Twilik said, studying Kaladin's face. You also lied to me when you said you weren't going to take revenge. How did you find out about Amram? Kaladin asked angrily. During this time I changed half a dozen owners. People told. Slave owners mainly. We have to be friends, you see, because no one else can stand us. Then you know I didn't get these marks for desertion. Yes, but we have to pretend, right? If a person is guilty of terrible crimes, he cannot be sold. And even with a saber on your head, they won't give you a good price. If I can't sell you well, you don't want that, right? Let's play together. I will say that you are a deserter, and you won't say anything. Easy game, right? Illegal. We are not in Alefka, Twilik said. There are no laws here. Besides, you were officially sold precisely because of desertion. Say anything different and you'll earn a reputation as a liar. And a headache for you. A minute ago you said that you were not capable of revenge. I can change my mind. Twilik laughed. If you haven't already learned this, you probably won't learn it. Besides, didn't you threaten to throw me off a cliff? Personally, I think you've already learned. But now let's discuss what to do next. My card died untimely. Kaladin hesitated, then sighed. I don't know these places, he said honestly. I never went this way. Twilik frowned. He leaned closer to the cage and peered closely at Kaladin, although he did not move closer. After a moment he shook his head. I believe you, deserter. It's a pity. Well, you have to trust your own memory. Either way, this map was lying. I'm almost glad you broke it, otherwise I would have done it myself. If I happen to have portraits of my ex-wives, then I will probably arrange for our paths to cross and take advantage of your exceptional talents. He walked away from the cage. Kaladin watched him leave, then cursed himself. And what is all this for? The Espren asked, approaching him with her head up. I almost liked him, Kaladin said, resting his head against the wall of the cage again. But after what he did? Kaladin shrugged. I'm not saying Twilik isn't a bastard. But he's an attractive bastard. He hesitated, then grimaced. The worst kind. When you kill someone like that, you feel guilty all the time. The van leaked during a superstorm. Kaladin was not surprised. He suspected that Twilik took up the slave trade, not because of a good life. He would gladly sell other goods, but something, either the lack of working capital or the need to quickly pay off debts, forced him to choose the least respected job. People like him cannot afford luxury or even a secure existence. They are forced to constantly get out of debt. In this case, that meant vans that leak. The walls could withstand the winds of a superstorm, but it was extremely uncomfortable behind them. Twilik almost missed this hurricane. The map Kaladin tore up was likely purchased from roaming storm guards and included dates for superstorms. The time of the next storm could be predicted mathematically. Kaladin's father did this as a hobby. He could pick the right day 8 times out of 10. Volume 1 Chapter 13. The wooden walls rattled against the bars of the cage as the wind hit the van, shaking it. Like a clumsy giant, he began to play with it, tilting it from side to side. The tree groaned, and streams of icy rain poured through the cracks. Lightning struck, followed by thunder, the only light remaining. Sometimes lightning flashed without thunder. The slaves groaned in horror, thinking about the father of storms, the shadows of the fallen radiants or the void bridges, all those who were said to appear during the most brutal superstorms. They huddled together against the far wall of the van, keeping each other warm. Kaladin sat alone, leaning his back against the bars. Kaladin was not afraid of the stories of those who come with storms. In the army, he had to endure a superstorm a couple of times, sitting under a cliff ledge or in other improvised shelter. No one liked being outside during a superstorm, but sometimes it was unavoidable. And whoever walked with the hurricane, perhaps the father of storms himself, was not as deadly as the stones and tree branches rushing through the air. In fact, the very first impact of water and wind, the wall of the storm, was the greatest danger. The longer the hurricane lasted, the weaker the wind became, and at the end it was no different from light rain. Therefore, Kaladin was not afraid that the Voidbridger would appear and decide to eat them. But he feared for Dvalakwa. The slave owner waited out the hurricane in a battered wooden shelter built into the bottom of a wagon. Supposedly the safest place in the caravan, but a whim of fate. The hurricane carried boulders that could overturn the van. In this case, of course, Twilig would have died. Blut and Tag immediately fled, leaving the slaves in cages closed on all sides with wooden walls. People would die a slow death from hunger and thirst, fried by the sun. The storm continued, shaking the van. Sometimes these winds seemed alive. And who said that this is not so? Perhaps there is a spren associated with every gust of wind. Or the spren themselves are gusts of air, who knows? Millions of spren have formed the force that so wants to destroy Kaladin's van. However, force intelligent or not lost. The wagon's wheels were locked to the nearby boulders, and the storm could do nothing to them. The gusts of wind became less frequent. The lightning stopped, the crazy roar of the wind was replaced by a light whistle. Only once during the entire journey did the superstorm manage to overturn the van. However, the slaves inside escaped with a few missing teeth and cuts. The wooden wall to Kaladin's right suddenly shook, then fell as Bluth unfastened its clamps. The mercenary, protecting himself from the rain, put on a leather coat. Streams of water flowed from the brim of his hat. When he opened the grate, streams of water poured out onto the huddled slaves. It was cold, although not as piercingly cold as at the height of the storm. Twilik always ordered the wagons to be opened before the rain stopped. He said that this was the only way to get rid of the stench and dirt. Bluth slid the wooden wall into place under the van, then removed the other two. Only the front wall, directly behind the coachman's place, could not be removed. It's too early to let go, Bluth Kaladin said. Deliverance. The end of the storm, when the rain was barely spitting, was still a long way off. It was pouring rain with strong gusts of wind. Today the owner wants to thoroughly wash the van. Why? Kaladin asked, standing up. Water flowed from his torn brown clothes. Bluth pretended not to hear. Perhaps we are not far from our goal, Kaladin thought, and peered carefully at the landscape. Over the past few days, the green hills had gradually given way to jagged rock formations, where hurricane-force winds had left nothing but crumbled cliffs and jagged ledges. On the rocky slopes, where there was more sun, only grass grew, the rest of the plants gathered in the shade. Immediately after the end of the superstorm, the earth came to life. The stone bud polyps opened and vines emerged from them. Other vines reached out from all sorts of cracks in the stone, looking for water. Trees and bushes unfold their leaves. All sorts of cramlings slid between the puddles, enjoying the abundance of water. Insects buzzed in the air, larger crustaceans, crabs and leguits, crawled out of their shelters. Even the stones seemed to come back to life. Kaladin noticed half a dozen airspren fluttering overhead. Translucent figures chased or flew in a race after the last gusts of the superstorm. Tiny rays of light surrounded the plants. Lifespren. They looked like green glowing motes or swarms of translucent insects. Legs with thin hair-like spikes raised in the air to alert them to changes in wind speed ran alongside the wagon, their long bodies supported by a dozen pairs of legs. A very familiar picture, but he had never seen leguits with a dark purple shell. Where did Twilik lead the caravan? These uncultivated hillsides were ideal for farmers. It is enough during the season of weaker storms, immediately following the lamentation, to scatter the seeds of lavis, watered with the sap of the heavy tree. And 4 months later you have polyps larger than a man's head growing all over the hill, ready to burst and give you mountains of grain. The chols shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, snacking on stone buds, slugs and small crustaceans that had appeared after the storm. Thug and Blut calmly harnessed them while an angry-looking Twi'lek crawled out of his hiding place. The head of the caravan pulled on his hat and black cloak, protecting himself from the rain. Usually he rarely went out until the rain stopped completely, which means he is striving to reach his goal today. Are they really that close to the coast? The only place in no man's hells where cities can be found. A few minutes later the wagons were rolling over the uneven ground. The sky cleared, the superstorm turned into a black spot on the western horizon. The sun brought blessed warmth, the slaves basked in its rays, streams of water flowed from their clothes and ran along the floor of the swaying van. A translucent streak of light flashed towards Kaladin. He got to the point where he took her presence for granted. The Aspren disappeared during the storm, but has now returned. As always. I have seen others of your kind, Kaladin said lazily. Others? She asked, taking the form of a young woman. She moved in the air around him, turning sharply and spinning, dancing to an inaudible melody. Other Windspren, Kaladin said. We were chasing the storm. Are you sure you don't want to fly away with them? She looked eagerly to the west. No, she said, continuing to dance. I like it better here. Kaladin shrugged. She stopped making fun of him, so now she didn't annoy him. There are others here, not far, she said. People like you. Slaves. Don't know. People. Not the ones here. Other. Where? She pointed a translucent white finger to the east. There. A lot of. Lots and lots. Kaladin stood up. He couldn't imagine that a Spren could know how to measure distances and quantities. Yes, Kaladin squinted, scanning the horizon. Yes, smoke. From fireplaces. He inhaled a gust of wind. If it weren't for the rain, he would have felt it sooner. Should he care? It doesn't matter where you are a slave, you are still a slave. He accepted this life. This is his way. Don't worry, don't worry. Still, he looked ahead curiously as the van climbed the hillside. Finally they reached the ridge, and the slaves saw what lay ahead. Not a city. Something different, bigger and grander. Huge military camp. Great Father of Storms, Kaladin whispered. The huge army set up 10 military camps in the usual Lethi style. Round, with civilians on the outside, a ring of mercenaries inside, citizen soldiers closer to the middle, and bright-eyed officers in the very center. Each camp was located in a stone crater of absolutely incredible size, the walls of which bristled with sharp edges. Like a broken eggshell. Volume 1 Chapter 14. 8 months ago, Kaladin had abandoned a very similar army, although of course much smaller. The military camp extended for several miles, both north and south. 1,000 banners with glyphs of 1,000 noble families floated proudly in the air. Here and there, mainly behind the craters, tents could be seen, but most of the army was located in stone houses. So, transformers. The flag that Kaladin had seen in the books fluttered over the camp directly in front of them. A dark blue background with white glyphs hoe and linel stylized to form a sword supporting a crown. House of Colin. Royal House. Kaladin looked around, dismayed. To the east stretched the country described in a dozen different stories about the king's war against the Parshendi traitors. The vast plain of rock so wide that he could not see the other side was cut by sheer bottomless chasms 20 or 30 feet wide. They turned the plain into a mosaic of jagged plateaus. Some are big, others are tiny. It was as if someone had broken a plate and then put it back together, leaving small holes between the pieces. The shattered plains, Kaladin whispered. What? The Windspren asked. Is there something wrong? Stunned, Kaladin shook his head. I spent many years trying to get here. This is what Tien wanted, at least in the end, to come here, to fight in the royal army. And here Kaladin is. Finally. Accidentally. He almost laughed. Absurd, he thought. I should have known. I should have understood. We never went to cities on the coast. We were heading here. To war. On the other hand, this place must be governed by Alethi laws. He had always thought that Twi'lek should avoid places like this. But here, most likely, he hoped to make good money. Ruined plains. Asked one of the slaves. Really? The others huddled around, eagerly looking ahead. In their excitement, they even forgot their fear of Kaladin. Yes, these are the shattered plains. Announced another. And this is the king's army. Perhaps we will find justice here, said the third. I heard that in the royal house the servants live no worse than the richest merchants, said another. And it's better to be a slave to a king than to someone else. We are in the lands of Vorin and must receive payment for our work. This was true. Working slaves were entitled to a small wage, half of what a free man received. In turn, a freeman often received much less than a full citizen for the same work. Not much, but something, and Alethi law demanded it. Only the Ardents, who in any case could not own anything, worked for food. Well, and also Parshmen, but they were more animals than people. Slaves could use this earnings to reduce their debt and, after years of hard work, redeem themselves. In theory, the van rolled down the hill as the others continued to chat, but Kaladin moved to the back of the van. He suspected that this was all a deception, with the help of which people were kept in submission. The slave was paid very little, and, in Kaladin's opinion, it was impossible to pay off the huge debt. He demanded several times that the previous owners pay him, but they always found a way to deceive him. They deducted from him for food, for housing, and they were all light-eyed. Russian, Amram, Katatam, every light-eyed Kaladin knew, slave or free, was corrupted on the inside, no matter how beautiful he was on the outside. They all looked like rotting corpses in luxurious silk clothes. The other slaves continued to chatter about the king's army and justice. Justice? Kaladin thought, resting his forehead against the bars. I'm not sure such a thing exists. Still, he found himself hesitating. Eventually, the king's army, 10 armies of crown princes, came to fulfill the pact of vengeance. If there was anything left that he allowed himself to desire, it was the opportunity to pick up a spear, to fight and try to become what he was, a person who cares. If he gets such an opportunity, it will be here. Heretic. I have seen the end and heard it called. Night of Sorrows, real devastation. Eternal storm. Received on the first day of the month Nan, 1172, 15 seconds before death. The subject is a dark-eyed youth of unknown origin. Shallan was not struck by how beautiful Jasna Colin was. Majestic, mature beauty. Such faces are captured in the portraits of the great scientists of antiquity. It was only now that Shallan realized that she had naively expected to see an ugly old maid, like the stern matrons who had taught her as a child. How else can you imagine an unmarried heretic over 30? Jasna turned out to be completely different. Tall and slender, with clear skin, narrow black eyebrows and thick onyx hair. She combed some of them up, wrapped them around a small gold ornament that looked like a scroll, and secured them with 2 long hairpins. The rest fell freely down, in small unruly curls. Even curly, they reached Jasna's shoulders, and if straightened, they would have been as long as Shallan's own hair and would have flowed down to her waist. And also an almost perfect face and piercing lavender eyes. She listened to a man dressed in fiery orange and white, the colors of the royal house of Carbanth. Her ladyship Colin was several fingers taller than her interlocutor, which means it's not in vain that they talk about the tall stature of the Alethi. Jasna looked at Shallan, noticed her, and returned to the conversation. Father of Storms. This woman is truly the king's sister. Restrained, stately, immaculately dressed in blue and silver. Jasna's high-collared dress was buttoned up and hugged a much higher chest than Shallan's. Its flaws fell freely almost to the floor. Long puffy sleeves, the left one is buttoned up to hide the safe hand. The free hand was adorned with 2 rings and a bracelet, connected by chains that supported a triangular group of gems on the back of the hand. Converter was a word that was used both for the people who performed the process and for the fabrial who made it possible. Shallan walked hesitantly into the room, trying to get a better look at the large, shining stones. My heart beat faster. The converter was exactly like the one she and her brothers found in the pocket of their father's uniform. Jasna and the man in royal robes walked towards Shallan, continuing their conversation. How will Jasna react to the fact that her ward has finally caught up with her? Or will he get angry at the slowness? It's not Shallan's fault, but people often expect illogical behavior from those below them. Like the entire huge cave outside, this corridor was also carved out of stone, but much more richly decorated with elegant chandeliers, inside of which there were stones with stormlight. Most of all there were purple garnets, less valuable stones. However, there were so many of them, shining with a bright purple light, that each chandelier cost a small fortune. Shallan admired the symmetry and beauty of the crystal that hung along the sides of the chandelier. Jasna moved closer, and Shallan heard the end of her sentence. Understand that this action may cause an unfavorable reaction from the devotees, said the woman in Alethi. It was very similar to Shallan's native language, Vedan, and she learned to speak it as a child. Yes, your grace, the man replied. Middle-aged, with a sparse white beard and pale grey eyes. The open, friendly face seemed very worried. The princess's companion was wearing a squat, cylindrical hat, the colors of which matched the orange and white of his clothes. Rich clothes. Royal steward. No. Precious stones on the fingers, demeanor, obsequious glances of other light-eyed ones. Father of Storms. Shallan thought. It's the king himself. Not Jasna's brother Ilhoka, but the king of Carbanth, Taravanjan. Volume 1 Chapter 15. Shallan quickly curtsied in an elegant manner, which Jasna noticed. Like mine, said the king. But you don't have to worry about me. Very good, said Jasna. The conditions suit me. Take me there and I'll see what can be done. And, if you'll excuse me, I have to talk to someone on the way. Jasna took a short step towards Shallan and waved her hand, inviting her to join them. Of course, your grace, said the king. He seemed to obey Jasna. Carbanth is a very small kingdom, a single city, and Alefka is one of the largest and most powerful states in the world. In fact, on the hierarchical ladder, the Alethi princess is much higher than the king of Carbanth, but protocol must be followed. Jasna moved a little away from the king, who was speaking with his retinue. Shallan hurried over to her. Your mightiness. I am Shallan Deva, who has asked to meet with you. I deeply regret that I could not find you in Dumadari. It's not your fault, Jasna said, waving her fingers. I foresaw that you wouldn't arrive on time. But when I sent you a letter, I still didn't know where I would go from Dumadari, and I left a note. Jasna wasn't angry, a good sign. Shallan felt her anxiety subside. I am impressed by your tenacity, child, Jasna continued. I must admit, I didn't expect you to follow me so far. After Carbanth, I was no longer going to leave you notes. It seemed to me that you had given up. Most people do this after the first few stages. Majority. So it was an exam. And Shallan turned him in. Yes, indeed, Jasna continued in a thoughtful voice. Perhaps I'll let you beg me to be your mentor. Shallan nearly stumbled, startled. Beg her? What did she do before? Your Grace, Shallan said. I thought that, and your letter. Jasna looked at her. I gave you permission to meet me, Miss Deva. I didn't promise that I would take you. Teaching and caring for my ward is a distraction from my work, and now I have very little time and even less patience. But you've come a long way. I will consider your request, although you must understand that I have very strict requirements. Shallan grimaced. The fact that you didn't lose your temper is a good sign, Jasna said. Lost your temper? Me, the light-eyed girl. You were surprised, Jasna said dryly. But you won't get a place with self-control alone. Tell me, how far have you advanced in science? Quite far in some areas, Shallan said. And very little in others. Very good, said Jasna. The king ahead of them seemed to be in a great hurry, but he was so old that, despite all his efforts, he walked quite slowly. Now I will appreciate your knowledge. Answer truthfully and don't exaggerate, because if you lie, I will find it out very quickly. However, don't be too modest. I don't have the patience for a simpleton. Yes, your grace. Let's start with music. How do you rate yourself? I have good hearing, your grace, Shallan said honestly. I sing best, although I learned to play the zither and wind instruments. Perhaps I am far from the best examples, but I am also far from the worst. I know most of the historical ballads by heart. Sing the chorus to Arden's song. Here. I don't like to be told twice, child. Shallan flushed, but began to sing. Not the best performance, but she didn't misinterpret the melody and didn't forget the words. Okay, Jasna said as Shallan paused for air. Languages. Shallan hesitated for a moment, tearing herself away from her frantic attempt to remember the next verse. Languages? I can, of course, speak your native Alethi, Shallan said. I can read Talon well and speak Azo well. I understand Selai, but I don't speak it. Jasna said nothing in response, and Shallan grew nervous. Letter? Jasna finally asked. I know the senior, junior and most popular glyphs and can draw them calligraphically. Like most children. Those who know me consider the security glyphs I drew to be quite expressive. Security glyphs. Jasna said. I thought you wanted to become a scientist and not a distributor of superstitious nonsense. I've been keeping a diary since childhood, Shallan continued, to practice writing. Congratulations, Jasna said. If I need to cook up a report on a stuffed pony or describe an interesting cobblestone, I'll send for you. Can you confirm your words with something? Shallan blushed. With all due respect, your grace, you received a letter from me, and it was so convincing that you decided to meet with me. That's right, Jasna nodded. It obviously took you a long time to write it. How are you with logic and related arts? I studied basic mathematics, Shallan said, still excited, and often helped my father with calculations. I read the complete works of Tormes, Nashon, Niali the Just and, of course, Nohadon. And Placini. Whom? No. Gabatin, Ystara, Manolin, Siasik, Shorka daughter Kashvat. Shallan cringed and shook her head. The last name is obviously Sinish. Are there really master logicians in Sinova? Does Jasna really expect her ward to study these dark texts? Yes, I understand, said Jasna. What about the story? Story? Shallan cringed even more. This is precisely the area, your grace, where my knowledge is insufficient. My father could not find a suitable teacher for me. I read all the history books he had. Which? Themes by Shallan mainly. Jasna waved her free hand dismissively. Waste of time. A superficial overview of historical events at best. I beg your pardon, your grace. Unpleasant gap. History is the most important of the humanities. Your parents had to take special care to study this particular field of knowledge if they ever hoped to send you to study as a historian like me. I have special circumstances, your grace. Ignorance is hardly a thing, Miss Dava. The longer I live, the more I realize that it is a natural state of the human mind. There are too many people fighting tooth and nail to defend this shrine and expecting you to be impressed by their efforts. Shallan blushed again. She knew there were many gaps in her education, but Jasna expected too much of her. She didn't say anything, but continued to walk next to him. What is the length of this corridor? Shallan was so worried that she didn't even look at the paintings they passed. They turned the corner, going deeper and deeper into the mountain. Okay, let's move on to science, Jasna said in a dissatisfied tone. What can you say about yourself? I have deeply studied the basic concepts of the sciences that a young woman of my age should know, Shallan said, her voice more constrained than she would have liked. What do you mean? I understand geography, geology, physics and chemistry. I studied biology and botany especially deeply, thanks to the relative freedom I enjoyed on my father's estate. But if you're expecting me to solve Fabricens's puzzle with a wave of my hand, you'll be disappointed. Don't I have the right to make reasonable demands on my potential students, Miss Dava? Reasonable? Your demands are no more reasonable than the demands of the 10 heralds on Judgment Day. With all due respect, your lordship, you want your potential mentees to already be real scientists. Perhaps I can find a couple of 80-year-old ardents in the city that will suit you. Perhaps their answers will satisfy you if, of course, they can hear the questions. Volume 1 Chapter 16. Yes, said Jasna, I see. Do you talk to your parents in the same impudent manner? Shallan winced. While traveling on the ship, she became accustomed to speaking too freely. Had she come all this way just to be driven away by Jasna? She remembered her brothers, impoverished, holding on to the rotten facade of the house with all their might. Would she really return to them without taking advantage of this opportunity? I don't talk to them like that, Your Grace. And I shouldn't have talked to you like that. I'm sorry. Well, at least you know how to admit mistakes. Still, I'm disappointed. Does your mother think you are ripe for guardianship? My mother left this world when I was a child, Your Grace. And your father soon remarried. On Malai's Javelma, if I'm not mistaken. Shallan looked at her in amazement. The House of Dava could boast of antiquity, but in terms of wealth and influence, it was very, very average. It spoke volumes that Jasna knew the name of Shallan's adoptive mother. My adoptive mother also left quite recently. She didn't send me into guardianship. I decided so myself. My condolences, Jasna said. Perhaps you should have stayed with your father, comforting him and looking after the estate, rather than wasting my time. The man walking ahead turned into another side passage. Jasna and Shallan followed him and entered a very small corridor, the floor of which was decorated with red and yellow carpets, and mirrors hung on the walls. Shallan turned to Jasna. Father doesn't need me. This is definitely true. But I really need you, as our conversation proved. If ignorance irritates you so much, can you with a pure heart miss the opportunity to rid me of it? I've done this more than once, Miss Dava. This year, 11 young women have already asked me to take custody. You are the 12th. 12? Shallan thought. In 1 year. And she also assumed that women were trying to stay away from Jasna because of her dislike of the Devatarians. The group reached the end of a narrow passage, turned a corner, and much to Shallan's surprise came across a huge block of stone that had fallen from the ceiling. A dozen worried servants stood around her. What's happening? The smaller stones had already been removed, but a huge recess gaped ominously in the ceiling. The sky, however, was not visible. They were most likely deep underground. A huge stone, larger than a man, fell into the passage to her left and blocked the entrance to the room. Shallan thought she heard screams from the other side. The king walked up to the stone and said something in a comforting voice. Then he took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The dangers of living in a building carved into stone, Jasna explained, stepping forward. When did it happen? She was probably not called to the city specifically for this. The king simply took advantage of her presence. During the last superstorm, Your Grace, the king answered. He shook his head, his thin, drooping beard shaking. Perhaps the court architect is able to break into the room, but this will take a lot of time, and the next superstorm is expected in a few days. In addition, then the ceiling will sag even more. I thought Carbon was protected from superstorms, Your Majesty, Shallan said, causing Jasna to look at her in surprise. The city is truly protected, young lady, said the king. But there's a rock behind us. Sometimes landslides occur on the other side that make the entire mountain shake. He looked at the ceiling. Internal rockfalls are extremely rare, and we consider this area to be fairly safe, but this is stone, Jasna said, and it is impossible to tell whether there is a weak vein hiding under the surface. She looked at the monolith that had fallen from the ceiling. It will be difficult. I will most likely lose a very valuable focal stone. The king began, wiping his forehead again. If only we had the blade of shards. Jasna stopped him with a wave of her hand. I have no intention of discussing the terms of our deal again, Your Majesty. Access to Palladium is very expensive. Send the servants for wet rags. Let everyone move to the other side of the corridor. I also recommend that you wait there. I will stay here, the king said, causing his retinue to protest, including a huge man in a black leather cuirass, possibly a bodyguard. The king ordered them to be silent, raising his wrinkled hand. I won't hide like a coward when my granddaughter is trapped. No wonder he's so worried. Jasna did not argue, and judging by her eyes, she was not at all worried about the king's life. And Shallan herself too, judging by the fact that she did not send her away. The servants came up with pieces of wet cloth and distributed them to everyone. Jasna refused. The king and bodyguard brought theirs to their faces, covering their mouths and noses. Shallan took hers. What's the point of all this? The servants slipped wet rags into the gap between the stone and the wall for those inside. Then all the servants rushed down the corridor. Jasna touched the boulder. Miss Deva, she said, which method would you choose to determine the mass of the stone? Shallan blinked. I would ask His Majesty. Its architects have most likely already figured it out. Jasna raised her head. An elegant answer. Have they really already done this, Your Majesty? Yes, Your Grace, Collins said the king. About 15,000 cables. Jasna glanced at Shallan. Point in your favor, Miss Deva. Scientists should not waste time discovering what is already known. But I keep forgetting this lesson. At these words, Shallan felt herself bursting. She already realized that Jasna does not give out such praise left and right. But does this mean that the high-born lady still considers her as a future ward? Jasna extended her free hand, and the transformer flashed. Shallan felt her heart beat faster. She had never seen the transformation happen before. The Ardents used their fabricals in deep secrecy, and she didn't even know her father had a transformer until her brothers discovered it. Of course they couldn't get it to work. One of the main reasons for her appearance here. Huge gems were inserted into the Jasna transformer, each of them should have been worth many spheres. The first is smoky quartz, clear, black, smooth. The second is a diamond, the third is a ruby. All were cut. A cut stone could contain more stormlight into glittering ovals. Jasna closed her eyes, pressed her hand to the fallen boulder, raised her head and took a deep breath. The stones on the back of her hand shone brighter, and the smoky quartz became simply impossible to look at. Shallan froze, even forgetting to breathe. The only thing she dared to do was squint her eyes to memorize the scene. A long tense moment and nothing happened. And then suddenly Shallan heard a sound. A low hum, as if distant voices were singing together a single clear note. Jasna's hand sank into the boulder. And the stone disappeared. Plumes of dense black smoke filled the corridor. It was quite enough to blind Shallan, as if thousands of fires were smoking at the same time, the smell of burnt wood. She brought the wet rag to her face and fell to her knees. Strangely, her ears were blocked, as if she had jumped from a great height. I had to swallow to let them go. Tears flowed from her eyes. She closed her eyes and held her breath. There was a buzzing in my ears. Finally everything passed. She opened her eyes slightly and saw the king and his bodyguard huddled against the wall next to her. Smoke rose to the ceiling, its smell permeating the entire corridor. Jasna stood with her eyes closed, probably because of the smoke soot covered her face and clothes, and left marks on the walls. Shallan had read about it, but she still looked in awe at Jasna, who had just transformed the boulder into smoke. Since the density of the smoke is less, it exploded and spread throughout the corridor. Volume 1, Chapter 17. So, the rumors were true. Jasna does have a working transformer. And very powerful. 9 out of 10 transformers were capable of very limited actions, creating water or grain from stone or a primitive one-room house from air or rags. However, powerful ones like this one could perform almost any transformation. Literally transform one substance into another. The Ardents are probably gritting their teeth, seeing this sacred powerful relic in the hands of a person not from their order. And more heretics. Shallan struggled to her feet, a rag pressed to her mouth, breathing heavily in the damp but relatively clean air. She swallowed, her ears letting go again as the air pressure in the hallway returned to normal. The next moment the king rushed to the entrance to the room, freed from the rubble. The little girl and several nannies and maids sat there, coughing and sneezing. The king pressed the girl to his chest. She was still too young to wear a modesty sleeve. Jasna opened her eyes and squinted, as if trying to figure out where she was. Then she took a deep breath and did not cough. In fact, she even smiled, as if enjoying the smell of smoke. Then she turned to Shallan and looked at her carefully. You're still waiting for an answer. I'm afraid you won't like him. But you haven't finished the exam yet, Shallan said, trying to sound confident. Of course, you can't put a mark until you've listened to the end. Am I not finished? Jasna frowned. You didn't ask me about women's arts. Drawing and painting. I never saw the point in them. But this is art, Shallan objected, driven to despair. Her main achievements, many consider them to be the finest arts of all. I brought with me an album with drawings. Jasna pursed her lips. Fine arts border on frivolity. I've weighed everything, child. I can't accept you. I'm really sorry. Shallan's heart sank. Your Majesty, Jasna said to the king. I would like to go to Palanium. Now. Asked the king, hugging his granddaughter to him. But we were going to have a feast. I really appreciate your offer, Jasna interrupted him, but I have everything in the world except time. Of course, the king agreed. I will personally take you there. Thank you for your granddaughter. As soon as I found out that you asked permission to enter, continuing to chat, he walked down the corridor. Jasna followed him silently. Unable to move, Shallan stared after them, detached. She clutched the bag to her chest and lowered her hand with the rag. 6 months of chasing, and now she squeezed the rag in despair. Dirty water ran over her fingers. She wanted to cry. 6 months ago, when she was a child, she would have done just that. But everything has changed. She has changed. If she is defeated, the house of Deva will fall. Shallan felt her resolve redouble, though she was unable to stop a few tears of frustration from escaping the corners of her eyes. She will not give up until Jasna puts her in chains and orders the soldiers to drag her away. With a surprisingly firm step, she walked in the same direction as Jasna. 6 months ago she told her brothers her desperate plan. She will become a student of Jasna Colin, a scientist, a heretic. But not for learning. Not for prestige. But in order to find out where she keeps the converter. And steal it. 4th bridge. Cold. Mom, I'm cold. Mother, why can I still hear the rain? Will he stop? Received from Vevis, 1172, 32 seconds before death. The subject is a light-eyed girl, approximately 6 years old. Finally, Tulik released the slaves from their cages. Now he was not afraid of escapes or uprisings. Behind him was the wilderness, ahead were hundreds of thousands of armed soldiers. Kaladin descended to the ground. The van stood in one of the craters, the jagged wall of which rose directly to the east. Kaladin's bare feet stood on smooth stone, no plants to be seen. Puddles of rainwater were still visible in the depressions. Fresh and clean air, the sun directly overhead, although because of all this eastern dampness he always felt wet. Everything around them spoke of an army that had long been stationed here. The war had been going on since the death of the old king, for almost 6 years. Anyone could tell the story of the night the Parshendi killed King Gavila. Platoons of soldiers marched by. They walked in the directions indicated on the painted circles that stood at each intersection. An incredible number of long rock shelters and tents, many more than Kaladin had seen from above. No transformers could create so many shelters. After the stench of the slave caravan, the air was filled to the brim with the wonderful, familiar smells of cured leather and oiled weapons. However, many of the soldiers did not look very neat. No, they didn't seem dirty, but rather undisciplined. They wandered around the camp in unbuttoned uniforms, pointing fingers at the slaves and sneering. And this is the Crown Prince's army. Elite forces fighting for the honor of Alefka, the one Kaladin sought to join. Bluth and Tag watched warily as Kaladin joined the chain of other slaves, but he had no intention of doing anything. This was not the time for provocations. Kaladin had seen how mercenaries acted surrounded by real soldiers. Now they walked as if in a parade, proudly sticking out their chests and putting their hands on their weapons. They pushed several people into place and, cursing hoarsely, hit one in the stomach with a baton. And they stayed away from Kaladin. The royal army, said the slave next to him. The same dark-skinned man who told Kaladin about running away. I thought they would sell us to the mine. But it's not that bad at all. We will clean latrines or repair roads. It's strange to look forward to cleaning toilets or working in the hot sun. Kaladin had hoped for something different. I hoped. Yes, he found that he still hoped. On a spear in his hands. At the enemy in front of you. Yes, that's how he could live. Tulik was talking to an important-looking, light-eyed woman. Black hair is styled in a complex hairstyle and sparkles with amethysts, wearing a dark crimson dress. She looked like Leril the last time they met. Probably 4th or 5th Dan, wife and scribe of one of the officers. Tulik began to praise his wares, but the woman raised a thin hand. I have eyes, slave trader, she said with an aristocratic accent. I'll check them myself. She walked along the line, followed by several soldiers. Her dress was made in the fashion of the noble houses of the Alethi, a strict silk blouse, tight-fitting to the body, a fitted skirt. It was buttoned at the sides from the waist to the neck and ended in a small gold-embroidered collar. The long cuff of the left sleeve covered the safe arm. Kaladin's mother always wore a glove, much more practical from his point of view. Judging by her face, she wasn't too impressed by what she saw. These men are dying of hunger and are extremely weak, she said, taking the thin rod from the hands of the young assistant. With its help, she brushed the hair from the forehead of one of the slaves and checked the mark. And you want 2 brooms of emeralds per head. Twilakwa broke out in a sweat. Perhaps 1.5. And what will I do with them? You can't put such dirty people near food, and most of the other work is done by scabs. If your grace does not need them, I can turn to other crown princes. No, she said, spanking the slave with the rod, who recoiled from her in fear. 1.25. They will be able to cut down trees in the northern forest. She walked towards Kaladin. This is another matter. This one is much stronger than the others. Volume 1 Chapter 18. I thought you'd like him, Twilakwa said, approaching her. He's quite. She raised her staff, silencing the slaver. There was a small cut on her lower lip. A little kuswid root and everything will go away. Take off your outer clothing, slave, she commanded. Kaladin looked into the blue eyes and felt an almost irresistible urge to spit in them. No, he can't afford it. Not now. He took his hands out of his bag-like shirt, let it fall to his waist and exposed his chest. Despite 8 months of slavery, his muscles were significantly better than the rest. So young and so many scars, the aristocrat said thoughtfully. You are military? Yes. The windspren circled the woman, studying her face. Mercenary? No, Amram's army. Citizen, second Nan. Former citizen. Twilakwa quickly intervened. He was. She waved her wand again, silencing Twilakwa. Then she brushed back Kaladin's hair and examined his forehead. Shash, she said, clicking her tongue. Some of the soldiers stepped closer, their hands on their swords. Where I come from, slaves who deserve this are killed. Then they are lucky, Kaladin said. And how did you deserve it? Killed someone, Kaladin told a prepared lie. Please, he made a plea to the heralds. Please. He had not begged anyone for anything for a long time. The woman raised an eyebrow. I am a murderer, your grace, Kaladin said. I got drunk and made mistakes. But I wield a spear as well as anyone else. Take me into your Brightlord's army. Let me fight. It was such a strange thing to lie to slander himself, but the woman would never allow Kaladin to fight if she thought he was a deserter. Let him better think that he killed by negligence. Please, he thought. Become a soldier again. For a moment it seemed to him that he wanted nothing in the world with such force. How much better it is to die on the battlefield than spend your life cleaning pots. Twilakwa walked over and stood next to the light-eyed woman. He looked at Kaladin and sighed. He is a deserter, your grace. Don't listen to him. No. Kaladin felt a searing flash of anger consume all his hopes. He raised his hands to Twilakwa to strangle the rat, but then something hit him on the back. He groaned, stumbled and fell to his knee. The aristocrat stepped back, pressing her safe hand to her chest in alarm. One of the soldiers grabbed Kaladin and hauled him to his feet. Yes, she finally said. Very unfortunate. I can fight, Kaladin breathed, ignoring the pain. Give me the spear. Let me. She raised the staff, cutting him off mid-sentence. Your grace, Twilakwa said, looking away from Kaladin. I wouldn't trust him with a weapon. Yes, it is true that he is a killer, but he is also known for his unruly nature. One day he led a revolt of slaves against their master. I can't sell him to you as a soldier. Conscience doesn't allow it. He hesitated. The slaves who rode in the same wagon with him, he could ruin them all with talk of escaping. My honor demands that I tell you this. Kaladin ground his teeth. He wanted to push away the soldier holding him, grab the weapon, and spend his last moments driving a spear into Twilakwa's fat belly. Why does this bastard care what his slave will be used as in the army? A curse. And why did I tear that card? Kaladin thought. Often cruelty is better rewarded than kindness. One of my father's sayings. The woman nodded and moved on. Show me the ones from his van, she said. I'll still take them because of your honesty. We need new bridgemen. Twilakwa nodded vigorously. He paused and leaned toward Kaladin before moving on. I didn't know how you would behave. These army guys, they'll blame the merchant if he doesn't tell them everything he knows. I'm so sorry. And the merchant disappeared. Kaladin grunted something, pulled away from the soldier's hands, but remained in the chain. Let it be. Chop trees and build bridges or fight in the ranks of warriors. Who cares? He will continue to live. His freedom, family, friends and, most precious of all, his dreams were taken away from him. There is nothing more to take from him. After examining all the slaves, the woman took a writing board from her assistant and wrote a few short notes on paper. Twilakwa gave her his ledger, which recorded how much each slave wrote off his debt. Kaladin glanced at the numbers. Judging by the scribbles, not a single slave copied anything. Perhaps Twilakwa falsified the records. More likely. From now on, let all his salary go to pay off the debt. Let's see how they fidget if he exposes their deception. What will they do if he is close to paying off the debt? Most likely, he won't even know about it. Depending on how much these bridge workers earn, it will take him 10 to 50 years. The light-eyed woman sent most of the people to the logging site. She sent half a dozen of the thinnest ones to the army canteen, despite everything she said before. And these, she said, pointing her staff at Kaladin and the other slaves from his wagon, sent to the bridgemen. Tell Lambrel and Gars that the tall ones need special attention. The soldiers laughed, and one of them pushed Kaladin's group onto the road. Kaladin endured. And why on earth would they be polite to him, and he wasn't going to give them a reason to be even more cruel. More than mercenaries, soldiers hated only deserters. On the way, he could not help but notice the flag flying over the camp. The same symbol adorned the soldiers' uniforms. A yellow glyph power in the shape of a tower and a hammer on a dark green field. Flag of Crown Prince Sadius, supreme ruler of Kaladin's home district. A mockery or a gift of fate, which of them made him end up here? Soldiers wandered lazily through the streets of the camp, even those who, judging by their appearance, were on duty. Garbage and waste lay everywhere. Lots of civilians. Whores, working women, coopers, shopkeepers and cattle drivers. Even children rushed through the streets of this half-city, half-camp. There were also parshmen here. They carried water, dug trenches, and carried sacks. This really surprised him. Aren't they fighting the parshmen? Or do they not care about those who rebelled? Apparently they don't care. The parshmen worked with the same obedience as at Hearthstone. Perhaps this makes sense. At home, Alethi fought with Alethi. Why shouldn't the parshmen be among both sides? The soldiers led Kaladin around the northeastern quarter of the city. The journey took a long time. Old habits forced Kaladin to remember the way. The barracks built with the help of the converters looked exactly the same. The edge of the camp resembled jagged peaks. Countless superstorms had eroded the high circular wall, so there was an excellent view to the east. The vast area stretching to the east seemed an excellent place to build an army before a raid into the shattered plains. At the northern edge of the field there was a smaller camp, just a few dozen barracks. In its center are piles of squat tree trunks that Kaladin had seen along the way. They were processed by one group of carpenters. They cleared the logs of their sticky bark and sawed them into planks. Another group put together cumbersome structures from boards. Shall we be carpenters? Kaladin asked. One of the soldiers laughed roughly. No, you will be bridge workers. He pointed to a group of pathetic-looking people who were sitting on a rock in the shade of the barracks, eating from wooden bowls with their fingers. Outwardly, the food was terribly similar to the gruel that Twilig fed them. The soldier pushed Kaladin so hard that he almost fell on the gentle slope and hurried forward. The remaining 9 slaves followed him, urged on by the soldiers. Not one of those sitting on the stones even looked at them. They all wore leather vests and simple trousers. Only a few were wearing dirty shirts laced in front over their naked bodies. The bridge workers didn't look much better than the slaves, although they weren't as skinny. Volume 1 Chapter 19. Hey, Gars, take reinforcements, one of the soldiers shouted. A man who had been standing lazily in the shadows, at some distance from those who were eating, turned his head towards them. His face was so covered with scars that his beard grew in patches. One eye was missing. He did not bother to cover it with a bandage. The remaining one was brown. The white knots on his shoulders pointed to the sergeant, and there was a springy strength about him that Kaladin had come to associate with someone who knew the way to the battlefield. These runts. Gars responded, chewing something and leisurely walking towards them. They won't even stop an arrow. The soldier behind Kaladin pushed him forward. Her ladyship Hashel told you to do this specifically. The rest are ordinary rednecks. The soldier nodded at the approaching slaves. Gars glanced at them, then looked at Kaladin. I fought, Kaladin said. In the army of Brightlord Amram. I don't care, Gars snapped and spat. Kaladin hesitated. When Amram? You mentioned that name again, Gars snapped. Served some unknown landlord, huh? And you want to impress me? Kaladin sighed. He had already met such people, junior sergeants with no hope of promotion. Usually their only pleasure in life is to mock those who are even more unfortunate than them. Well, so be it. You have the mark of a slave, Gars snorted. I doubt you even held a spear in your hands. Your grace will have to come down and join us. A Spren girl Kaladin knew well came down and examined Gars carefully, then closed one eye, pretending to be one-eyed. Kaladin, seeing her antics, smiled. Gars misunderstood his smile. He sniffled and stepped towards Kaladin. At that moment the camp was filled with the sounds of horns. The carpenters looked up as the soldiers who had brought Kaladin rushed towards the center of the camp. The slaves next to Kaladin looked around in fear. Father of storms. Gars swore. Bridge workers. Get off your butts, you rednecks. He started kicking those who were eating. They dropped their bowls and jumped to their feet. They were wearing simple sandals, not boots. Go ahead, Grace, Gars ordered, pointing at Kaladin. I did not say. I swear to the abyss, I don't care what you said. You're with them to the 4th bridge. He pointed to a group of departing bridgemen. The rest wait here. I'll sort you out later. Move your legs or I'll hang you on the nearest beam. Kaladin shrugged and hurried after the group. Many similar brigades ran out of the barracks and narrow streets. How many are there? There are about 50 barracks, each with 20 or 30 people, which means that in the Crown Prince's army, there are more bridgemen alone than Amram has soldiers. Kaladin's team, maneuvering through planks and piles of sawdust, approached a large wooden structure. It seemed to have suffered heavily from superstorms and battles. Along its entire length, potholes and holes could be seen, as if from arrows. This is the bridge, huh? Yes, Kaladin thought. Wooden bridge, 30 feet long, 8 feet wide. Slightly sloped front and back, no railings. The frame is made of thick, strong logs, with the widest boards nailed in the middle. There were 40 to 50 bridges, about the same number as barracks. Does each barrack serve one bridge? 20 people gathered near each bridge. Guards appeared, armed with a wooden shield and a sparkling mace. No one else had weapons. He quickly began checking each team. Having reached the fourth bridge, he stopped. Where is your foreman? He asked. Dead, answered one of the bridgemen. Last night I threw myself into the cleft of honor. Gars swore. Can't you keep the foreman for at least a week? Storm take you. Go ahead, I'll be close to you. Listen to my commands. In the evening we will choose another foreman from those who survive. He pointed a finger at Kaladin. You, Lord, to the back. The rest of you, go ahead. Storm be damned, I'm not going to get reprimanded because of your stupidity. Come on, move it. Everyone stood up. With nothing else to do, Kaladin walked to the open slot at the tail of the bridge. He was mistaken in his assessment. 35 to 40 people had gathered near each bridge. 8 rows, each could accommodate 5 people, 3 from below under the bridge and 1 from each side. There weren't enough people in his brigade to fill all the ranks. Kaladin groaned, lifting the storm-cursed weight up and under it. Probably very light wood was used, but the thing was still terribly heavy. He helped lift the bridge into the air. People filled the slots along the entire length and then slowly lowered the bridge onto their shoulders. The bottom at least had rods that could be used as handholds. Many placed pillows on their shoulders over their vests and distributed them to alleviate the pressure. Kaladin didn't have a vest, so the wooden supports dug right into his skin. He couldn't see anything, his head was in a recess, the tree blocked the view of everything around him. Surely people on the sides have a better view. He suspected that everyone was trying to stand on the side. The wood smelled of oil and sweat. Forward. Gaz's muffled voice was heard. Kaladin groaned as the crew slowly began to run. He couldn't see where he was going and tried not to trip as the team descended onto the eastern slope of the shattered plains. Soon Kaladin was sweating and cursing quietly, the wood rubbing and biting into the skin on his shoulders. Blood has already begun to flow. Poor fellow, said a voice from the side. Kaladin looked to his right, but the wooden supports blocked his view. You, Kaladin breathed. You talk to me. You shouldn't have insulted Gaz, the man responded. His voice sounded dull. Sometimes he puts a newcomer in the outer row. Sometimes. Kaladin tried to answer, but was out of breath. He thought he was in good shape, but for 8 months now he had been eating gruel, being constantly beaten, and waiting out superstorms in leaky cellars, dirty barns or cages. He is unlikely to become what he was. Inhale and exhale deeply, said a muffled voice. Focus on the steps. Count them. It helps. Kaladin followed the advice. He heard other brigades running nearby. Behind them were the familiar sounds of marching soldiers and the sound of horseshoes hitting stone. The army followed them. Rockbeds and small shoots of shaleroot constantly came under his feet, threatening to knock him off his feet. The ground of the shattered plains was uneven and riddled with cracks, covered in scree and rock shelves. This explained why wheels were not used in such difficult terrain. Porters moved much faster than any cart. Very soon he knocked down and cut his legs. They couldn't give him shoes. He gritted his teeth in pain and continued walking. Just another job. He will continue and survive. The heavy sound of boots. He felt a tree under his feet. A bridge, permanent, crossing the chasm between the plateaus. The brigade crossed it in seconds, and he again felt a stone under his feet. Go, go! Gaz roared. Go ahead, the storm will take you. They continued to run as the army crossed the bridge behind them, hundreds of boots hitting the tree. Blood flowed down my shoulders, every breath seemed like torture, my sides were squeezed by a tight pain. He could hear others breathing, sounds moving through the confined space under the bridge. In any case, he is not alone. Let's hope they reach their goal quickly. Vain hope. The next hour became real torture. Far worse than being beaten by slave owners, far worse than any wound on the battlefield. The march seemed endless. Kaladin vaguely recalled seeing permanent bridges as he looked down across the plains from the wagon. They connected the plateau where it was easier to bridge the cracks, but not where it was easier to walk. Very often it was necessary to take a detour, turn north or south, before returning to the east. The bridge workers moaned, cursed, grumbled and gradually fell silent. Kaladin never looked through any of the cracks. He was running. And he ran. And he ran. He no longer felt his legs. He knew that if he stopped, he would be beaten. He felt as if his shoulders were worn down to the bone. He tried to count his steps, but was unable to due to fatigue. Volume 1 Chapter 20. But he didn't stop. In the end, thank the heralds, Gars commanded stop. Kaladin flinched, stumbled and almost fell. Dash raise. Dash Gars roared. The men raised the bridge, Kaladin's arms cramped from staying in one position for too long. The bridgeman below stepped to the side and grabbed the handles on the sides. Dash lower it. Very uncomfortable and difficult, but these people had a lot of experience. The bridge didn't turn over, so they put it on the ground. Dash push. Kaladin stepped back, confused, while the others leaned on the side and rear handles of the bridge. They were on the edge of a crack over which there was no permanent bridge. On the edges of them, other brigades were also pushing bridges forward. Kaladin looked back. An army, 2,000 men in forest green and pure white. 1,200 dark-eyed spearmen, several hundred cavalrymen on rare breed, expensive horses. Behind them is a large group of heavily armed, light-eyed men in shining armor, with large clubs and square steel shields in their hands. It seems that they deliberately chose a point where the crevice was narrower and the first plateau was higher than the second. The bridge turned out to be twice as long as the width of the crevice. Gars cursed at Kaladin, who joined the others as they creaked as they pushed the bridge along the ground. When the bridge sank to the other side with a thud, the bridgeman stepped aside and allowed the cavalry to gallop across the abyss. Kaladin was so exhausted that he didn't want to see anything. He collapsed on the stones, turned over on his back, and lay listening to the tramp of soldiers moving across the bridge. Other bridgemen lay nearby. Gars, with a shield behind his back, walked among the brigades, shook his head and called them slackers. Kaladin wanted only one thing: to lie down, look at the sky and forget about everything in the world. However, his military training suggested that his muscles might begin to cramp. And then the way back will be even worse. The training had belonged to another person, from another time. Almost from dark times. Kaladin was no longer him, but he still needed his experience. Groaning, Kaladin forced himself to sit up and began to stretch his muscles. The soldiers crossed the fourth bridge, spears held high, shields in hand. Gars looked at them with obvious envy, and Kaladin's spren danced around the sergeant's head. Despite his fatigue, Kaladin felt a pang of jealousy. Why is she dancing around this braggart? A few minutes later, Gars noticed Kaladin and frowned at him. He asks himself, why aren't you lying down? Dash said a familiar voice. The man who walked next to Kaladin lay not far from him and looked up at the sky. Older than Kaladin, with graying hair and a long tanned face that complemented his friendly voice. He looked as exhausted as Kaladin. Kaladin continued to rub his muscles, ignoring Gars's gaze. He tore off pieces of his baggy clothes and bandaged his arms and legs. Luckily, he was used to walking barefoot, so his feet weren't too damaged. He had barely finished when the last of the foot soldiers crossed the bridge. They were followed by several mounted light-eyed ones, in shining armor. In the middle rode a man wearing red-polished shard armor. They were not like the ones Kaladin had once seen. Each armor was a unique work of art, but they were made in the same style. Richly decorated armor, joined together without seams, a magnificent helmet with an open visor. There was something foreign about them. They were created in another era, when the gods still walked around Rosha. Dash King? Kaladin asked. The wrinkled bridgeman smiled wearily. Dash, we can only guess. Kaladin turned to him. If it were a king, the bridgeman explained, we would be in the army of Brightlord Dalinar. The name was vaguely familiar to Kaladin. Dash, he's the crown prince, right? King's uncle. Dash, yes. The best person and most worthy shard bearer in the royal army. They say he always keeps his word. Kaladin chuckled disdainfully. The same was said about Amram. You should have been in Crown Prince Dalinar's army, boy, the bridgeman said. He doesn't use people to move bridges. Doesn't like to use it, to say the least. Dash, hey, you cramplings. Dash, Gars yelled. Dash, climb. The bridgeman grumbled, but stood up. Kaladin sighed. A short rest was enough to realize how tired he was. I'll be happy to go back, he muttered. Dash back. Dash, the wrinkled bridge worker was surprised. Dash, are we not going back? His friend chuckled bitterly. Dash boy, we haven't started yet. And be glad you didn't start. The worst is yet to come. And the nightmare entered its second phase. They crossed the bridge, dragged him to the other side, and again lifted him onto their wounded shoulders. Then we crossed the plateau. On the other side they lowered him to the ground and threw him over the next abyss. The army passed, and everything happened all over again. At least a dozen times. They rested in between, but Kaladin was so exhausted and tired that a short break was not enough. He barely had time to regain his breath before he had to carry him again. And they were expected to move quickly. The bridge workers rested while the army crossed, but then they had to overtake the soldiers and reach the next abyss before the army. The new acquaintance warned Kaladin that if they did not put the bridge in place quickly enough, they would be flogged at the camp. Gaz gave orders, swore, kicked the bridgemen if they moved slower, and never touched the bridge. Kaladin soon came to hate the bony, scarred sergeant. Strangely, he did not feel hatred towards the other sergeants. After all, it is their job to scold people and make them move. That wasn't what burned Kaladin. Gas sent him to work without a vest and sandals. Despite all his bandages, tomorrow Kaladin will be covered in scars from head to toe. He will be so wounded and exhausted that he will not be able to walk. Gas is just a small soul. He risked losing his porter and not completing his task, and only because of hasty anger. Storm-damned freak, Kaladin thought, drawing strength from hatred to endure all trials. Several times, after pushing the bridge into place, Kaladin fell, feeling unable to stand again. But when Gaz commanded the rise, Kaladin somehow forced himself to his feet. Otherwise, Gas will win. But why do they keep coming? What's the point? Why so far? They must protect this bridge, this precious cargo. They must stop the sky and go, they must. He began to delirium. Legs, run, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Dash, stop. He stopped. Dash, raise. He raised his hands up. Dash, lower it. He stepped back and lowered the bridge. Dash, push. He pushed the bridge. Die. He gave the last command to himself every time. He fell on a stone, the stone bud hurried to retract the vines when he touched them. He closed his eyes, no longer thinking about the cramped muscles, and fell into a trance, half sleeping, half waking, which seemed to last one heartbeat. Dash, get up. He stood up, swaying on bleeding legs. Dash, go. He crossed without bothering to look at the deadly gap on the other side. Dash, drag. He grabbed the handle and pulled the bridge towards himself. Dash, swap. Kaladin stood silently. He didn't understand the command. Gas has never given it before. The soldiers formed ranks, moving with a mixture of timidity and forced relaxation, as people often move before battle. Several forebodings spread like red wisps of steam rising from the ground and curling in the wind came free from the rocks and swirled among the soldiers. Battle. Gaz grabbed Kaladin by the shoulder and pushed him towards the front of the brigade. Novices go through this part first, Your Grace. Dash, the sergeant grinned evilly. Kaladin silently raised the bridge above his head, along with the others. The same handles, but in the first row there were holes, right in front of his face, and he could look ahead. All the bridgemen swapped places, those in front stood back, and those in the back, including Kaladin and his wrinkled friend, stood forward.